She stood beside the man who was supposed to love her, dressed in white, trembling not from cold but from the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. And she never saw the knife coming. Not because she was blind, because she trusted him. That's the thing nobody warns you about betrayal. It doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the hands you've held in the dark, from the voice that once whispered your name like a prayer. Tonight, Luna Seraphine. Vale learns the most brutal truth a wolf can learn. Some bonds aren't broken by fate. They're broken on purpose. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's ride this storm together.
Yan.
The hall smelled of pine resin and burning cedar, the way it always did on blood moon nights. And Seraphine had spent 3 days convincing herself that smell meant safety. She stood at the far end of the grand ceremonial hall of Crescent Fang, positioned where the stone floor met the first of 7 wide steps that descended toward the throne dais. The hall was older than the current bloodline, older than 4 bloodlines, if the stonemason's carvings on the eastern wall were to be believed. 12 columns of black granite, each as wide as 3 men standing abreast, rose from floor to vaulted ceiling, and between every pair of columns burned the ancestral flames, set in iron cradles that had never once gone dark in recorded history. The flames were amber tonight, which the elder women said was a sign of coming union. Seraphine had told herself that 3 times in the last hour. She was 24 years old, and she had the kind of stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness. Her hair was dark, pulled back from her face with a circlet of hammered silver that had belonged to her mother, and her dress was the ceremonial white of a Luna receiving her formal acknowledgement. Stiff at the collar, embroidered at the hem with the running wolf sigil of Crescent Fang in silver thread. It fit her the way ceremonial things always fit, correctly and without comfort. Around her, the hall held close to 2,000 wolves. They filled the tiered galleries above, pressed shoulder to shoulder on the main floor, spilled into the antechambers with their necks craning for a view. Blood moon ceremonies happened once every 7 years in the old calendar, and a formal alpha mate acknowledgement during a blood moon hadn't occurred in 40 years. Whispers moved through the crowd the way wind moves through high grass, fast, directional, impossible to stop. Seraphine kept her chin level and her eyes forward. At her left shoulder stood Mira Castle, her closest companion since childhood, dressed in the deep green of a Luna's personal attendant. Mira was shorter than Seraphine by nearly a head and had the kind of nervous energy that expressed itself as small, constant movement, shifting weight, adjusting the fold of her sleeve, smoothing the same piece of fabric she'd smoothed 6 times already. "You're going to wear through that seam," Seraphine said quietly, not turning her head. "I'm not nervous," Mira said. "I'm just cold." "The hall is 80 degrees. Mira said nothing for a moment, then, "He's late. He's always late. Not for ceremonies." Seraphine heard that. She filed it next to all the other small things she had been filing for the past 6 weeks. The canceled dinners, the meetings that ran long, the mornings she'd woken alone in the Alpha suite to find his side of the bed untouched, the way his lieutenants had stopped quite meeting her eyes. Each small thing filed in its own careful drawer. None of them spoken aloud. A pack Luna did not bring uncertainty to public spaces. That was one of the first things the elder women had taught her, back when she'd first been brought to the palace at 17, freshly bond-marked and still smelling of the outer territory she'd been raised in. "You are the still water," they'd told her. "The pack sees its own reflection in you. If you show them a disturbed surface, they disturb themselves." 7 years of being still water. The drums started. The low ceremonial drums, 8 of them arranged at the base of the dais, struck the opening rhythm simultaneously, and the hall responded the way it always did to ceremony. Every conversation cutting off at once, bodies straightening, the particular hush that falls over a crowd when it shifts from audience to witness. The ancestral flames in their iron cradles flared amber gold, and the warmth of 2,000 pressed-together bodies hit Seraphine in a wave that smelled of anticipation and old stone. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened. Alpha Ronan Draven entered the way he always entered ceremonial spaces, like the room was already his before he walked into it, like the architecture had been built around the particular way he moved. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical authority that had nothing to do with size alone. His ceremonial armor was black steel inlaid with the crescent fang crest at the chest, and his dark hair was shorter than when Seraphine had first met him, cropped close at the sides now, which she'd always thought made him look harder than he needed to. He was 30 years old. He had been alpha for 6 years. He had been her mate for all 6 of them. The hall watched him move. Seraphine watched him too, the way she always did in ceremonial moments, cataloging the details that told her how a night would go. The set of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, whether his second in command, a broad man named Cale, walked half a step behind as usual or something different. Something different. Cale was not walking behind Ronan tonight. He was walking behind 2 people. Seraphine caught the change in the crowd before she fully processed what she was seeing. A subtle shift in the watching stillness. A collective breath that altered in quality. Some instinct moving through 2,000 wolves at the same instant that communicated something has changed before the thing itself was visible. Then Ronan stepped fully into the light of the nearest ancestral flame, and the woman at his right side stepped with him, and Seraphine understood. She had known Celine Voss for 4 years. Most pack members knew Celine in the way you know someone who operates in the same corridors as you, by sight, by name, by the position she held. Council aide, territorial advisor. She was 2 years older than Seraphine, with the kind of deliberate elegance that read differently depending on the room, polished in council meetings, something else entirely in private circles. She had copper-colored hair that she wore loose more often than convention strictly called for, and she had a way of occupying space in a room that had always reminded Seraphine faintly of a territorial flag being planted. Celine was wearing white, not the embroidered ceremonial white of a Luna formally acknowledged. A different white, softer, deliberate, chosen, but white. On a blood moon night, in the grand hall, walking beside the alpha. The crowd felt it. The hush shifted quality again, moving from anticipation into something that had no clean name. The sound of 2,000 people processing something they hadn't prepared for, holding it briefly before any of them had decided how to respond to it. Seraphine's hands were at her sides. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. She made her face do nothing. Ronan reached the base of the steps. He stopped at the appropriate mark, the way he'd been trained since boyhood, and the drums went quiet on a single beat. His eyes moved to Seraphine. He looked at her the way you look at something that is about to become complicated, not without feeling, but with a kind of removed assessment that she recognized from his council face, and that she had never in 7 years seen him turn on her. "Seraphine," he said. His voice carried the way voices always did in this hall, designed by old architects who understood acoustics as an instrument of power. "Ronan," she said. The name sounded different in the silence. She'd said it 10,000 times. Tonight it sounded like the last time. He stepped up to the dais level. Celine moved with him, half a step back now, aware of the lines of ceremony even as she crossed them. Cale and the other lieutenants spread to their formal positions, and Seraphine watched the way none of them looked at her. The specific skill of looking away from something you know is happening and have already made your peace with. That was when she knew the shape of it, not the details. The shape. And the shape was something she had no drawer for. "I'm going to speak to the pack," Ronan said, and his voice was for her alone now, close enough that it didn't carry, though in this hall she was never fully certain of that. "I need you to listen, and I need you to be what this pack needs tonight, not what you're feeling." "Tell me what I'm about to be feeling," she said. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. "This is about the pack. Everything with you is about the pack." "It is." And he said it without apology, without flinching. That was the thing about Ronan. He had never once pretended that the pack came second to anything. She had understood that about him from the beginning. She had loved him knowing it. What she hadn't understood, what she was understanding now for the first time in the amber light of flames that were still burning as though nothing had changed, was that she had misunderstood what position she occupied in the ordering. He stepped away from her to address the hall. The drums struck a single beat, the signal for formal address, and 2,000 wolves found their full attention. "Crescent Fang!" Ronan's voice filled the hall from column to column, from floor to gallery, the way it had been trained to do since he was a boy watching his father command this same space. 7 years ago, under a different blood moon, the mate bond was recognized between Luna Seraphine and myself. That bond has served this pack. She has served this pack. I want that truth stated plainly before what I say next. The quality of silence in the hall had changed again. It was rigid now, the kind of silence that holds its breath. The North is fracturing, Ronan continued. We have lost 2 allied clans to the border wars in 18 months. The Ashvin pack raids have cut our eastern grain supply by 30%. We are facing a winter that the War Council believes will kill vulnerable members of this pack if we do not build new alliances before the first snow. Seraphine stood on the step where he had left her. Her breathing was deliberate. She could feel Mira at her shoulder, could hear the way Mira had gone completely still in a way that was different from her usual fidgeting stillness. Alliance in the Wolf Kingdoms, Ronan said, is built on bond and blood. The Voss family holds loyalty treaties with 11 northern clans that we cannot reach by any other means. The Voss family heir, and here he paused, a single beat, and in that beat every person in the hall understood what was coming before the words did, is prepared to formalize a bond with Crescent Fang, for the sake of this pack's survival. Celine had not moved. She stood at the base of the dais with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed this moment, who knows where the light falls and where to hold her chin and how long to maintain the expression she'd prepared. Seraphine, looking at her across 30 feet of ceremonial stone floor, recognized the rehearsal behind the stillness and thought, she has been here many times before tonight. She has stood in this room in her mind so many times that the real room is almost ordinary to her now. Ronan turned to Seraphine. The Alpha bond will be shared, he said, as the old codes allow in times of pack necessity. Seraphine remains Luna. Her position is not diminished. The word shared detonated in the hall without making any sound. Seraphine heard it land. She heard it move through the crowd the way a stone moves through a surface of water. The impact point and then the radiating rings, table by table, gallery section by gallery section, the shift of weight, the exchanged looks, the specific murmur of people processing something that is happening directly in front of them and seems both impossible and inevitable simultaneously. She stood on the step. She felt the mate bond in her chest the way she had always felt it. A warmth, a presence, a directional awareness like an internal compass that always knew where Ronan was in the world. 7 years of that compass. 7 years of waking up with it and falling asleep to it and sometimes in difficult moments holding on to it like a rope. She felt it crack, not break, not yet. The way old stone cracks before it gives. A sound that is almost interior, almost inaudible, the structural warning that precedes the fall. Seraphine, Ronan's voice again, direct, certain, the voice of a man who has made a decision and closed the door on reconsideration. I'm asking you to do what you've always done. I'm asking you to be what this pack needs. The hall was waiting. 2,000 wolves, the ancestral flames, the black granite columns, the iron cradles with their amber fire, all of it waiting for her to demonstrate what a Luna does when her alpha dismantles her in public for the survival of the many. She had been trained for this. Be the still water. She opened her mouth. You're asking me, she said, and her voice came out level, carrying in the hall's acoustics the way voices always did here, to kneel beside your mistress and call it alliance. The hall went to a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after something has been said that cannot be unsaid, where the air itself seems to recognize the shift. Ronan's jaw tightened, just slightly. This isn't the place. You made it the place, she said. You brought this into the hall. You put her in white. You put me on the steps. She felt something strange happening in her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet. Something colder. Something that came from a place she hadn't known was in her. You made this a public moment, so I'm speaking in it. Seraphine, 7 years. She said it quietly, which in this hall meant it reached every ear. 7 years I held this pack's grief and this pack's joy and everything that came between. I held it while you fought the border wars and sat the councils and built the alliances that didn't require selling the mate bond to accomplish. 7 years I was what you needed me to be. She paused. One breath. And tonight you need me to kneel. I need you to understand what's at stake. I understand exactly what's at stake. She looked at him for a moment, the way you look at something you are memorizing, the way you look when you know you are seeing it for the last time. The question is whether you do. Celine had not moved throughout any of this. She was watching Seraphine with an expression that was carefully constructed to be neutral, not triumphant, not guilty, nothing that could be named or held against her. Seraphine looked at her directly for the first time tonight. Celine met the look. "You've been very patient," Seraphine said. "This wasn't," Celine began. "Don't," Seraphine said it quietly. "Don't perform innocence in this room. We're past that." Ronan stepped toward her. "Enough. I'm asking you formally, as Alpha of Crescent Fang, to accept the restructuring of the bond for the sake of this pack and to—" "Kneel beside her," Seraphine said. "That's the ask. Say it plainly." His silence was the answer. "Say it plainly, Ronan." "Yes," he said. One word, hard as the stone floor. "For the pack." She felt the bond crack again. Wider this time. She felt it the way you feel an injury that you haven't finished processing. The delayed recognition, the body lagging behind what the mind already knows. Somewhere in the tiered galleries, she could hear weeping. One voice, a woman, from the upper gallery, poorly suppressed. She didn't look up. She reached up. The gesture was small. She brought her right hand to her chest, pressed 2 fingers against the center of it, the place where the bond lived in that particular interior warmth. She had seen the old bond severing rite performed once, in her childhood, when she was 7 years old and barely understood what she was watching. A mated pair standing in a field at the edge of the outer territories. The ceremony short and brutal, and spoken in the old language of the North. She didn't have the ceremony. She had her fingers and the intent behind them, and she had the knowledge that a bond built on betrayal does not require old words to undo. It only requires one of the 2 people who carry it to release it. She pressed her fingers in, and she let go. What happened in her chest was not describable in any language she'd been taught. It was the subtraction of something that had been as constant as her heartbeat for 7 years. A warmth that had become so baseline that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the weight of your own bones. And then it was gone. And the absence had a shape. And the shape was large and cold and final. She had nothing. And from nothing she felt something else rise, slower, darker, bearing no resemblance to the warmth it replaced. A clarity. The clarity of a person who has survived the thing they feared. She held her fingers to her chest for 3 more seconds. The hall watched without breathing. Then she lowered her hand. "Seraphine." Ronan's voice had changed. He had not expected this. She could see it in the micro-adjustments of his face. The fractional shift. The thing he was suppressing. "What did you—" "I released it," she said simply. The hall broke. Not into chaos, but into a sound that was between sound and silence. A collective intake. A wave of voices beginning simultaneously. The response of 2,000 people confronted with an act they had heard of but never witnessed. The ancestral flames in their iron cradles flickered. Every one of them simultaneously, a single pulse of motion, as though something in the old architecture had registered what had just occurred. Ronan was staring at her. She watched him absorb it, the real-time processing of a thing he'd believed was not possible because he had believed she would not. She recognized this look from 7 years of knowing him. He had calculated many things about tonight. He had not calculated this. "You can't—" Kale, his second, from his position at the foot of the dais. "The bond can't be severed unilaterally without—" "Tell him how it feels," Seraphine said quietly, not looking away from Ronan's face. She watched Ronan feel it. Watched it hit him. The subtraction on his end. The sudden absence of the compass he'd carried without thinking about it. The thing that had pointed toward her for 6 years now pointing at nothing. He was not a man who showed pain openly. But she had known him for 7 years, and she saw the precise second it registered. "Good," said the cold new thing inside her. "That is its own sentence." She turned away from him. "Don't." Ronan's voice had an edge she had not heard from him before. Not command. Something rawer. "Seraphine, don't walk away from this hall." She walked away from this hall. The crowd parted. This was the remarkable thing. They parted. The bodies moving back on both sides to create a path she had not asked for. Some instinctive collective response that she didn't have the distance to fully understand. She heard voices, fragments, a woman saying something in the old northern dialect that Seraphine only partially knew. She heard a man somewhere to her left say her name once, quietly, not addressing her, just speaking it to the person beside him. The way you speak the name of something you are watching become history. Mira was at her shoulder. Seraphine, get my cloak, Seraphine said. Her voice was still level. She was surprised by this. She had expected something else. She was the still water. The heavy one, and boots. Mira calculated something. It's 8 degrees outside. The snow started an hour ago. I know. You can't leave tonight. The storm, the heavy cloak, Mira. Mira went. Not because she agreed, because 7 years of standing beside Seraphine had taught her that there were moments where agreement was irrelevant. Behind Seraphine, the hall had not recovered. She could hear Ronan trying to reassert order, his voice, the command register, addressing the pack. She did not listen to the words. She moved through the wide outer corridor of the grand hall, past the ancestral tapestries that lined the walls in their cedar frames, past the guards at their posts who looked directly forward with the focused concentration of men who have been trained to see only what they are supposed to see. At the end of the corridor was the small service entrance she had used since her first week in this palace, when she'd been 17 and overwhelmed and had needed to leave ceremonial spaces without ceremony. A low door, old iron latch, stone steps down to the rear courtyard. She stepped through it. The cold hit her like intention. It had been building all day in the way northern storms build, not as a surprise, but as a progression. Each hour dropping another 2 degrees, the sky pressing lower, the smell of incoming snow transforming by degrees from distant to immediate. The rear courtyard was open to the sky, stone paving dusted white at the edges, the torches in their wall brackets burning against a wind that was trying to undo them. She had no cloak yet. She stood in her ceremonial dress and felt the cold move directly through it. The cold was fine. The cold was clarifying. She stood in it and breathed it and felt it replace something inside her. She had no other word for what was happening in her chest, except that it was large and it was honest, and it was completely unlike anything she'd been trained to feel in this place. The back of the courtyard looked north. From here, in daylight, you could see the beginning of the northern wastes, the vast territory beyond Crescent Fang's borders that had been unclaimed and ungoverned since the collapse of the old northern treaty councils 2 generations back. It was the direction caravans didn't take, the direction children were taught to face away from in stories meant to keep them close to the fire. In the dark and the falling snow, she couldn't see anything there at all. Only dark and the white movement of snowflakes that were getting heavier now, filling in the corners of the courtyard stonework with the quiet efficiency of weather that has made a decision. Behind her, the service door opened. She didn't turn. Mira? Yes. The cloak settled over her shoulders, the heavy one, wolf fur lined, that she'd never found an occasion appropriate enough to wear before tonight. She felt the weight of it and the instant replacement of cold with heat and thought distantly that she would need to give Mira more credit for the entirety of their long friendship. She pulled the cloak closed with both hands, held it, breathed. The hall, Mira said. I know. He's trying to... I know. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do? What she was going to do was leave. She understood this the way she understood structural things, not as decision, but as recognition, the identification of something that had already been decided by the event itself. She was going to leave because staying was no longer a condition she was willing to negotiate. She was going to leave because the cold new thing in her chest had made itself clear. The life she'd built here was built on a foundation that had just revealed itself as fiction. And she was not a woman who lived in fictions once she'd seen them. She was going to leave. And the northern wastes were north. Seraphine, Mira said, something different in her voice now. The storm is... I heard you. People die in those wastes in storms like this one. People die in lots of places. That's not... Mira's voice cracked slightly at the edge. She recovered it. That's not the answer. That's not an answer. I'm not going to die, Seraphine said. She said it with the flatness of someone who hasn't fully tested the statement and doesn't have time to. But I'm not staying in this palace tonight. Silence. Then Mira said, I'll pack provisions. Mira, you'll need food and a blade and something for your feet because those ceremonial boots are going to fail you in a hard mile. Her voice had shifted into the practical register that appeared in her in emergencies. The same voice she'd used when Seraphine had been ill with the Ashfin fever 2 winters ago, when Mira had gone for 3 days without sleep. "Give me 20 minutes." She didn't wait for a response. The service door opened and closed again. Seraphine stood alone in the courtyard. The snow was coming harder now. She could feel it against her face in the specific way of heavy snowfall. Not individual flakes, but a consistent pressure, cold and continuous, the accumulated weight of a storm that had gathered all day and was now committed. She pulled the cloak tighter, looked north, saw nothing. Somewhere behind her, through stone walls and iron doors, she heard, or imagined she heard, the ancestral flames respond. Not sound, a quality, an extinguishing of some warmth that was not temperature, that she had lived inside for 7 years without knowing it was conditional. It was gone now. She could feel the absence of it the way the back of the courtyard looked north, as an opening, a direction, something that had not existed for her before tonight, and that would exist for her now for the rest of whatever came after this. She stood in it. She breathed in it. She let the cold do what cold does. 22 minutes later, she counted. She had always counted things in uncertain circumstances, something the outer territory childhood had built in her. The service door opened one more time. Mira appeared with a pack that was larger than 20 minutes should have allowed, which told Seraphine that Mira had started packing before she'd asked. Seraphine looked at her. "I've known you since you were 17, Mira said. "I know when you've made up your mind." She held out the pack. Blade on the left side, 2 days of food, water flask, sealed. A pause. "I should come with you." "You shouldn't." "Seraphine, if you come with me, you lose everything in this palace and gain nothing but a hard road north in a blizzard." She took the pack from Mira's hands, held it. "Stay. Be useful here. Watch what happens and remember it." Mira's expression was doing several things simultaneously. That's not a comfort. It's not meant to be a comfort. It's meant to be the truth. She lifted the pack onto her shoulders over the cloak, adjusted the weight. The ceremonial boots were wrong for this. Mira was correct about that, but they were what she had. "Send no one after me. Tell them I'm dead if you have to." "You're not going to die," Mira said, with the flatness of someone making a statement that cannot afford to be wrong. "Then tell them I'm gone, and mean it the same way." She crossed the courtyard. She reached the north gate, the small outer gate, more a gap in the wall than a designed exit, used for deliveries from the outer granary. And she lifted the iron bar and pushed it open against the weight of the wind that was now carrying snow horizontally. The wind took the gate and swung it hard, and she stepped through it and did not look back. The north opened in front of her like a held breath. The torches behind her were immediately invisible in the snowfall, their light swallowed within 20 steps, and before she'd covered 50 yards she was walking in a darkness that was not quite total, the snow itself giving off a faint luminescence in the way of heavy snowfall, the world reduced to white movement and cold stone beneath her feet and the dim shape of what might have been a tree line 300 yards ahead. She pulled the cloak tighter. She walked. She walked for an hour before she allowed herself to feel anything. She was a mile into the northern wastes, and the cold had moved from surface to interior by the time she understood she was not going to be able to keep it compartmentalized any further. It arrived with the bluntness of something that has been waiting. The grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself as grief at first. That arrives as a physical pressure behind the sternum, a difficulty in the breathing that has nothing to do with the cold, though the cold was extraordinary. She had known Ronan for 7 years. She had loved him. Not without knowing his faults, not without understanding the way the pack always came first, not without the quiet daily renegotiation of what it meant to love a man whose loyalty was fundamentally to a collective rather than a person. She had known all of this and loved him inside it, and tonight she had felt him calculate her and find her acceptable loss. She let herself feel it for exactly the duration of 3 full minutes. She counted. Then she put it down. She didn't suppress it. She put it down the way you put down something heavy when you need both hands. Both hands for walking north in a blizzard. Both hands for surviving whatever the wastes had in front of her. She would pick it up again when she could afford to carry it. She walked. The tree line she'd seen proved not to be a tree line, but a series of rock formations, and beyond them the terrain opened into a long, flat expanse of what in summer would be marsh ground, and in winter was frozen hard enough to hold weight. She tested it with her first step, put her weight on it gradually, felt nothing give. She crossed it. The cold was working its way into her feet through the ceremonial boots. Mira had been right. They were decorative artifacts, not walking implements, and the soles were already wet through in the places where her steps had compressed the snow into liquid. She counted this the way she counted all threats, noted, filed, not acted upon yet. There was nothing she could do about the boots right now. She walked. An hour past the marsh, the storm eased slightly. Not ended. The wind dropped by some degrees, the snow becoming vertical again instead of horizontal, and she could see further ahead. What she saw was the northern wastes in its winter aspect, a vast, interrupted geography of black stone and white snow and the occasional skeletal outline of a winter-stripped tree. No lights, no smoke, nothing that said habitation. She had known it would be like this. She had known this the moment she'd started walking, and she had started walking anyway, which told her something about what she was willing to accept in exchange for not going back. She crossed the dark expanse. Around the second hour, she heard the first wolves, not the howl of a pack running or a hunt in progress. Something different. A sound in the middle registers, short and repeated, that the outer territory instincts she'd been taught to suppress in 7 years of palace living were reasserting now. The sound of wolves closing. She stopped. The dark around her moved. She drew the blade from the left side of the pack the way Mira had described. She hadn't looked for it before now, had trusted the placement, and she had it in her hand before she'd completed the thought. She stood in the dark with the snow falling vertically and the blade in her hand and felt her breathing shift into the specific register of someone who is very still and very awake, and waiting to understand what kind of danger they are about to meet. There were at least 4 of them. She couldn't see them yet. She could hear the weight of them in the snow. The specific compression, the distribution of sound that told her pack formation, not individual. Rogue formation, the way a group moves when it has no ceremony or order to its hunting, only purpose. She turned slowly, keeping her back to nothing, putting a rock formation at her rear. The first one showed itself 30 feet ahead, and it was a wolf in its wolf form, which told her this was a hunt and not a diplomatic party. It was large, winter pale, with the specific quality of leanness that said it had been living hard for months. It moved with its nose low, confirming what it already knew. It looked at her. She looked back. "I know who sent you," she said. The wolf didn't respond, but its weight shifted. Behind it, she heard the others stop moving. "You're going to have to decide," she said, "whether his gold is worth what I'll cost you." The wolf held, watching. She watched it back. Her blade was in her right hand, and she held it the way the outer territory men had taught her to hold a blade when she was 12 years old and her father was still alive. Not raised, not threatening, simply present, the statement of it enough. The wolf lowered its head. Not submission, aggression. The weight shift of a predator committing. She had 4 of them, and she had a blade, and the cold had been in her feet for 2 hours, and the mate bond was gone from her chest, and her entire life was behind her in ruins, and ahead of her was the dark north, and this wolf was about to make a mistake. "All right," she said softly. "All right." The wolf launched. She moved to the right. It was not elegant. Her feet were numb enough that the footwork was approximate, and the wolf was faster than she'd calibrated for. And what saved her was not skill so much as the decision she'd already made standing in that courtyard, that she was not going to die tonight, not in this storm, not on this frozen ground. Not before she'd given the cold new thing in her chest a chance to find out what it was. The blade found the wolf's shoulder. It screamed, the strange sound of a large wolf in pain somewhere between howl and shriek, and hit the ground rolling, and she was already turning for the second one, which came in low and fast from her left. She dropped to a knee to take it under its trajectory and put her shoulder into its chest, and it went over her, and she felt the impact of it up through her spine like a bell struck badly. The third one hit her from behind. She went into the snow. Cold. White. The weight of the wolf on her back. She got an elbow back and connected with bone somewhere and heard a yelp, and she rolled, wrong direction, too slow, and the fourth one was there, and she brought the blade up, and the fourth wolf stopped. Not from her. It stopped and went absolutely still, and in that stillness she heard something. A single sound, low, coming from the dark ahead of her. Not a howl. A command. The kind of sound that carries in its frequency the entire weight of a territorial claim, the full authority of a wolf who is at the apex of whatever hierarchy exists here. A sound that said, without elaboration, "These are mine, and you are nothing in their country." The three remaining wolves pulled back. They moved away from her with the specific speed of animals that have received a clear instruction from something they respect more than they want what they were about to take. She was on her knees in the snow with the blade in her hand and blood on her fingers from where the wolf's shoulder had been, and her ceremonial dress was torn at the sleeve and her boots were soaking through entirely, and she was breathing so hard that her exhales were visible as white clouds in the cold dark. She looked toward the sound. A figure stood at the edge of her visibility in the snowfall, tall, broad in the shoulders, standing completely still in a way that was different from waiting. More like a thing that simply exists in a place, the way stone exists, without the energy expenditure of intention. She couldn't see his face. The snow was too heavy and he was too far. But she could see the moment he took a single step toward her, and she could see, even in the dark, that the wolves gave that step a wide berth. Not from fear exactly, from recognition. The recognition of something else in their hierarchy that they had not revised. He stopped 10 feet from her. She looked up from the snow at a man she had never seen before, wearing the heavy weathered gear of the outer northern territories, with a face that was difficult to read in the dark and the snow, with eyes that caught the faint luminescence of the snowfall and reflected it back as something between assessment and attention. She kept the blade in her hand. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the specific economy of someone for whom speech was a tool used for precise purposes. "I'm aware," she said. He studied her for a long moment. She studied him back. He was not small. He had the kind of scarring visible even in bad light, old marks along the jaw and the back of his left hand, the record of someone who had been in the north long enough to accumulate its history on his skin. "You came from Crescent Fang," he said. "Not a question." "How do you know that?" "The dress." His eyes moved to the white ceremonial cloth, now wet and torn, and thoroughly wrong for any context except the one she'd left. "Nobody wears that kind of thing out here." "No," she said. "They don't." Another long pause. The snow fell between them. "You're heading north," he said. "That's where I'm going. There's nothing north of here except 6 days of bad terrain and 3 packs of slavers who will make you wish the wolves had finished it." She looked at him. "I know," she said. Something moved in his expression. Very small. Not pity. Something else. A recalibration. The adjustment of an expectation he'd arrived with. He looked at her for another 3 seconds with those unreadable eyes, and the snow falling between them and the wolves at the edge of the dark waiting for whatever this was. Then he said, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "How long have you been out here?" 2 hours. "Your feet," he said. She looked down. She hadn't realized the left boot had split at the seam. She'd felt it go, but hadn't processed it, and now the leather was pulling apart and the snow was directly in contact with her foot, which she couldn't feel below the ankle. "That's a problem," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood. It took more effort than it should have. Her knees were cold in the way that preceded their decision to stop cooperating, and the place where the wolf had hit her shoulder was going to be a significant bruise by morning. She stood. She put the blade back at her side. She looked at the man in front of her and the dark behind him and the wolves at the edge of both. "Who are you?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. The snow fell. Then, "Someone who knows this ground." He turned, a slight motion indicating the dark ahead. "There's shelter 2 miles north. We'll deal with the foot." She had no reason to trust him. She had also no particular reason to refuse. She was on the wrong side of Crescent Fang's walls with a ruined boot and a cold that was moving up her leg by degrees and a life that had ceased to exist behind her. She took a step toward him. He was already moving. She followed him into the northern dark, and behind her, 2 miles south, inside the amber-lit hall of Crescent Fang, the ancestral flames in their iron cradles went out, not one by one, all of them simultaneously in a single extinguishing that left 2,000 wolves in sudden darkness and the smell of dead smoke and a silence in which everyone in the hall understood that something very old had just rendered judgment on what had happened here tonight, and no one spoke. And the palace, for the first time in recorded history, was dark. The man moved through the snow the way people move when they've stopped needing to think about how to move. Not fast, but without hesitation, picking a line through the terrain that avoided the ice-sheeted depressions and the exposed rock that looked solid but wasn't. Seraphine followed his line exactly, placing her feet where his had been, because her left foot was failing her and she knew it, and she was spending the warmth she had left on forward motion rather than pride. 2 miles north, he'd said. She counted steps. Old habit. Her father had taught her that in difficult crossings, you break the distance into what you can manage, and what you can manage is always the next 10 steps, never the full 2 miles. 10 steps. 10 more. The cold was inside her boot fully now, a direct conversation between the frozen ground and the bones of her left foot, and the conversation was going badly. He didn't look back. He moved, and she followed, and the snow came down between them and around them, and the dark of the northern wastes had a quality she'd never experienced from inside a palace. It was total in a way that torchlit corridors prepare you very poorly for. No ambient light bleeding from windows, no distant fire, just the faint self-luminescence of heavy snowfall and the silhouette of the man ahead and the ground under her feet. She was not frightened. She examined this briefly, the way you examine an unexpected structural element. She had been afraid before. Fear had a texture she knew. This was not it. What she felt instead was a kind of compression, every peripheral concern stripped back by the cold and the dark, until only the essential remained. The next step, the warmth in her right foot, the blade at her side, the shape of the man ahead. This was what it felt like to be down to the studs. She filed it. The shelter appeared not as a structure, but as an absence of snow in her peripheral vision, a dark overhang of rock against the hillside, partially screened by a stand of winter-stripped pine, with a fire's glow visible from inside that was low enough to not be seen from distance. Smart fire. Deliberately small. He stopped at the entrance and turned. "Step careful on the left side," he said. "There's a drop." She stepped careful on the left side. The interior of the shelter was larger than the entrance suggested. A natural cave formation, widened at some point by tools, the walls darkened with old smoke. The fire was in a stone-ringed pit at the center, built low and efficient, the kind of fire that produces heat and almost no light. Around the walls, gear, packs, a bedroll, the specific organization of someone who has been living out of this space for some time. She went to the fire first because the alternative was falling down, and she was not ready to fall down in front of a man she hadn't determined yet. She crouched at the fire's edge and held her hands out, and felt the heat begin the painful process of renegotiating with her fingers. Her left foot was a problem she was going to have to address, but not yet. He moved past her and crouched on the other side of the fire. In the firelight he was clearer, older than she'd estimated in the dark. Not old, but weathered past the age his body probably carried, the way people get weathered who have spent significant portions of their lives outside. The scar on his jaw ran from just below his left ear to the corner of his mouth and was old enough to have flattened into the skin. His eyes were a gray that in this light looked close to the color of the rock walls around them. He was looking at her foot. "I need to see it," he said. "I know." She pulled the boot off. This was not graceful. The leather had swollen from wet, and the seam that had split was catching on itself, and she had to work it off in sections while the fire caught her face, and she breathed through the specific variety of discomfort that comes from returning circulation to a frozen extremity. The boot came free, and she set it aside and looked at her left foot. The skin was white in 3 toes. Not the pink white of cold, the flat white of something that has stopped participating. She looked at it with the flat attention of someone cataloging a threat. "How long have you been out?" he said. "Closer to 3 hours now." He made a sound that was not quite commentary. He moved around the fire to her side and crouched and picked up her foot with both hands. Not asking, just doing it. And she did not pull back because there was no efficient reason to pull back. And she had already identified that she was down to the studs tonight, which meant every choice had to carry its weight. His hands were very warm. She felt the warmth as a shock, that specific pain of the body being reintroduced to temperature after deprivation. The nerves registering first as pain before they settled into sensation. He held her foot with both palms pressed against the sole and said nothing. "I know what it is," she said. Then you know what comes next. Rewarming, slowly. Yes. He didn't move his hands. Anything faster, and you lose the toes. Maybe more. I'm not going to lose the toes. He looked up at her from his crouch, the firelight between them. That's not a decision you make. That's a decision the tissue makes. She held his gaze. He held hers. She understood this was a test of some kind, not adversarial, but assessing. The kind of assessment that a person who lives alone in dangerous country applies to everyone who enters their space. The animal-level reading of intention and capability, and whether the thing in front of them is going to become a problem that costs more than it's worth. She let him see exactly what she was. She had found, over 7 years of living inside a palace where everything was performed, that the most disarming thing available to her was the absence of performance. She was a woman who had walked out of her own life 3 hours ago in a blizzard in the wrong shoes and fought 4 rogues in the dark and still had the blade at her side. He could read what that added up to, or he could read it wrong. Either result would tell her something about him. He looked back down at her foot. "What's your name?" he said. "Seraphine." "Darius." He said it without the weight of someone offering a credential. Just information, traded because she'd traded hers. "The Iron Wolf," she said. His expression moved, very small, a contraction around the eyes that could be amusement or could be the dismissal of something tiresome. "You've heard that. I've heard it from inside Crescent Fang. That means it's traveled far enough to matter. Doesn't mean it's accurate." "What part isn't accurate?" He was quiet for a moment, still holding her foot, the warmth of his hands doing their slow, methodical work. Then, "The iron part, iron breaks." She absorbed this. He wasn't performing humility. She'd seen enough performed humility in the palace to recognize it. He said it the way you say a structural fact, because it was one, and because understanding the places where a thing breaks is the only way to manage them. "What did you do," she said, "before the North?" "Fought." "For who?" "Whoever needed fighting done." He shifted his grip slightly. "What did you do before tonight?" "Held things together." "For who?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Someone who didn't know what he had?" Darius didn't respond to that directly. He returned to the work of her foot. The sensation was coming back in the outer toes. The bad sensation, the pins and needles of returning blood, which she understood was preferable to its absence, but which was genuinely difficult to sit inside without a reaction. She sat inside it without a reaction. "You know those wolves were sent," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Crescent Fang wolves." "Yes." "Alpha's order." She looked at him. "You're very well informed for someone living in a cave." "Information is currency up here. I spend mine carefully." He finally set her foot down, gently, and reached for a wrap from his pack, dried moss and cloth, the field medicine of someone who doesn't have access to palace healers. "He sent kill orders after you, tonight before you'd been gone an hour." She sat with this. The fire snapped once. Outside, the storm had deepened. She could hear it against the rock face, the specific pressure of heavy snowfall against stone. He had sent kill orders in less than an hour. She turned this over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives under it. Not surprised, not yet fully arrived at the emotion beneath the information. She was storing it, another item in the inventory of tonight, to be examined when she could afford the examination. "How many?" she said. "2 groups. One caught the storm bad. The 4 you met were the second." He wrapped her foot with efficient hands, not tight enough to restrict, just enough to hold warmth. "There may be a third." "A third?" "He wants this clean." Darius looked up at her. "Whatever happened tonight, he wants no loose end walking north to tell a different story." She thought about Ronan in the hall, the way he'd looked at her before the ceremony, the council voice he'd used to describe her as an asset being restructured. She thought about the calculation she'd seen move across his face when she'd severed the bond. Not grief, not immediately, but the rapid recalculation of someone who'd had a variable behave unexpectedly. She had been a variable, and variables that behave unexpectedly get removed. "I know," she said. "Then you know staying in one location is—" "I know," she said again, quieter, sharper. He looked at her for 1 second, reading the tone, then let it go. He tied off the wrap and moved back to his side of the fire. She pulled the lesser boot from her pack, the one Mira had put in, bless her, a heavier outer territory boot 2 sizes wrong but functional, and worked it carefully over the wrapped foot. The fit was approximate. It would hold. I need to keep moving, she said. Not tonight. Tonight. If there's a third, he said, they're as blind as you are, and 3 times as cold because they're not next to a fire. He sat back against the cave wall. You move tonight on that foot, and you lose it. You lose the foot, and the rest of you follows inside 2 days. You wait 4 hours, eat something, let the tissue come back. A pause. Then we move. She caught the word. We, she said. He met her eyes. You don't know this territory, and you're offering to guide me. I'm offering to not watch something preventable. He reached for a pack behind him and pulled out dried provisions. The kind of food that has no social quality, just caloric density, and set them at the edge of the fire ring between them. There's a clan settlement a day and a half north. Small. They've had bad seasons. They won't turn you away if you arrive with me. She looked at the food. She looked at him. She understood she was being offered something and that the offer had a cost she couldn't fully assess yet. Not because he was concealing it, she didn't read concealment in him, but because she didn't have enough information about the North to know what any offer up here was actually denominated in. She picked up the provision and ate. Why do they trust you? She said between bites. I've pulled 3 of their people out of slaver wagons in the past year. And what did you take for that? Nothing. She looked at him. Nothing, he said again, without the weight of someone making a virtue of it. They had nothing worth taking, and I didn't want the debt it would have created. She chewed, swallowed, felt the warmth of the food move through her in a way that was almost structural, the body reasserting its basic arithmetic. She was cold and injured, and she had nothing left behind her, and the man across this fire was a stranger who'd sent wolves back from her with a single sound and was now wrapping her feet with field medicine and talking about debt. She had known worse starting positions. Tell me about the slavers, she said. He looked at her, a measured look. You just walked out of your life tonight. Most people in that condition need a few days before they start asking operational questions. I'm not most people. No, he said. You're not. He settled his weight back. The slaver operations up here have been running for about 8 years. 3 main warlords, territory between them, enough overlap that they don't fight each other but stay profitable. They target smaller wolf clans, ones without alliance backing, without territory strong enough to defend. Take the young and able, put them in labor camps on the deep ore operations in the far north. He paused. Crescent Fang knows about them. She went still. What? Crescent Fang has known for 6 years. There was a quiet agreement. The slavers don't raid south of the tree line. In exchange, he stopped. In exchange, she said. He looked at her steadily. In exchange, Crescent Fang doesn't bring its army north to clean them out. She sat with this the way you sit with a load-bearing revelation, carefully, taking time to feel where the weight was distributed, understanding that the structure of what she thought she'd known was now rearranging itself around this new column. Ronin. 6 years. She had been in that palace for 6 years, and she had sat in the rooms adjacent to these decisions, and she had not known. She had been what she was trained to be. The still water, the held space, the face of the pack that was never troubled. And while she performed that function, this had been happening in the rooms she wasn't in. The cold new thing in her chest had a name now. It wasn't grief. It was something older and harder, and less prone to erosion. How many people, she said, across all 3 warlords' operations? Yes. Estimates. Somewhere between 400 and 800. He said it without softening. Plus the ones who didn't survive transport. She looked at the fire for a long moment. Outside, the storm was doing its thorough work. And somewhere out there, a third group of Crescent Fang wolves was working through the dark toward the position she would have been in if Darius hadn't moved her first. She thought about 800 people. She thought about the quiet agreement. She thought about Ronan's speech in the hall, the Ashfin raids, the failing alliances, the grain supply, the speech about what he needed for the good of the pack, and she thought about the geography of what she now knew against what she'd been allowed to know. He had kept her in a specific shape. She understood this. Not cruelly, perhaps. Not with deliberate intent to limit. But a man who makes quiet agreements with slave warlords has a particular investment in keeping the people around him from knowing the full inventory of his decisions. And she had been cooperative. She had been still water. She had reflected back exactly what was presented to her and asked no questions about the room she wasn't in. That version of her had walked into the hall tonight in white. That version of her had stood on the steps and waited. "The clan you're taking me to," she said. "Have they lost people to the slavers?" 6 people in 2 years, 2 of them children. She nodded slowly. Something was happening in her that felt less like decision and more like arrival. The sense of reaching a coordinate she had been traveling toward without knowing it, the destination revealing itself in the act of standing on it. "When we get there," she said, "I want to hear everything." Darius looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that gave very little away. Then, "About what specifically?" "The warlords, their routes, their supply chains, the camp locations." She met his gaze and held it. Everything. The silence between them was the kind that has weight and direction. He was reading her. She let him read. "That's a different kind of walk north than you started with tonight," he said. "Tonight changed the walk," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. The fire shifted, settling into itself, the low, efficient burn of a fire that intends to last. His eyes moved once over the blade at her side and back to her face, and she understood the calculation, whether this was grief-making ambitious noise or something with the structure to support itself. She sat straight, with her wrapped foot extended and the wrong-size boot on it, and the torn ceremonial dress under the wolf fur cloak, and she met his assessment with the flatness of someone who has nothing left to perform. "All right," he said, and that was all. She slept in 4-hour sections, the way her body demanded, each time pulling up from sleep with the particular urgency of someone who no longer has a safe space to sleep deeply. The shelter held. The fire held. Darius moved in and out, checking the perimeter she understood, because that was the behavior of someone who kept people alive rather than simply occupied. And when she woke the second time, 2 hours before dawn, he was at the cave entrance facing out into the dark. "Third group?" she said, her voice rough from sleep. "Past south. They don't know the ground well enough to find this in the dark." He turned, came back to the fire, crouched to rebuild it from the coals. "They'll run a grid at dawn. Then we move at dawn." "Before." "Good." She ate again, drank from the water flask, worked her wrapped foot into the oversized boot with the focus of someone building something that needs to last the day. The pain was present, and she put it in the same place she'd put the grief. Noted, filed, not permitted to vote. She stood, tested the weight, it held. Darius was breaking down the camp with the practiced speed of someone who has done this many times. No wasted movement, the specific compression of essential gear, leaving the space behind in the state that would tell a tracker as little as possible about who had been there or how long. She watched him work and learned the movements, cataloging them the way she cataloged all things now, as available information, as tools for the inventory. "How long have you been north?" she said. 4 years. "What were you before?" A pause in the packing. Short. "A lieutenant." "For who?" "For a man whose name I don't use anymore." She understood the shape of this without needing the details. The North was full of people who'd come here carrying the wreckage of something that had been structured before and wasn't anymore. She didn't press. "Can you fight?" he said. She thought of the rogues in the dark, the blade finding the wolf's shoulder, the decision she'd made standing in the courtyard. "Yes." "How well?" "Well enough for tonight, better than yesterday." She shouldered the pack. "Worse than I need to be." Something in his expression, that minimal shift again, the compressed non-smile of someone who responds to directness as a form of currency. "Honest. What's the point of lying to you about it? You'll see either way." "Most people lie anyway. Most people are afraid of being accurately seen." She moved toward the cave entrance. "I'm past that particular fear." He looked at her for one more second, then picked up his own pack and moved past her to take the front. They left the shelter in the pre-dawn dark, moving north in the aftermath of the storm that had broken overnight. The snow settled now and deep enough to work against, but not deep enough to stop. The cold was the specific cold of post-storm, clear and absolute, a cold that had nothing left to say and was simply being what it was. Her breath came out white and fast, visible in the dark, and she kept her breathing measured because warmth was a resource she needed to manage. Behind them, she heard, or thought she heard, the sound of wolves at distance. Not the rogues. A pack formation, moving with the specific efficiency of wolves who know where they're going. Crescent fang wolves, running the grid at first light 2 hours early. Ronan was thorough. She had always known this about him. It was once something she'd respected. "They're running," she said quietly. "I know. Move." Darius lengthened his stride without breaking into a run, unnecessary expenditure, wrong in this terrain, and she matched him. They covered the first mile at a pace that made her left foot file a formal complaint, she noted, and dismissed. The terrain was rougher past the flat marsh expanse, the ground breaking up into irregular formations of rock and frozen soil, and Darius moved through it with the familiarity of someone who has walked it so many times it has stopped being navigation and become memory. She followed his line and trusted his ground reading because her alternative was to slow both of them down. At the crest of a low ridge, he stopped and crouched, and she dropped beside him without being told. Below them, in the gray pre-dawn light, the frozen marsh they'd crossed the night before was visible, and across it, moving in the particular spread formation of a hunt, 6 wolves in human form, armed, moving fast. Third group. Not the one that had passed south. A fourth. He had sent 4 groups. She crouched beside Darius on the cold ridge and looked at 4 groups of wolves sent to make sure she didn't reach whatever was north, and she felt the full cold architecture of what Ronan had done settle into its final shape inside her. Not a reaction to her leaving, not wounded alpha impulse, a structural decision, made fast and implemented with the specific resource expenditure of someone who could not afford to have her arrive at a free location with the knowledge she carried about the quiet agreement, about the slavers, about the full inventory of what he'd been doing in the rooms she wasn't in. She had never been a variable. She had been a liability with a face he trusted, right up until the moment she hadn't been. "How many are you expecting?" she said quietly. "That depends on how important you are." "Important enough." He looked at her with the sideways attention of someone tracking motion in their peripheral vision. "What do you know?" She looked at the hunt moving across the white expanse below them. "Enough that he can't have me alive and free in the north, where people might listen." A long pause. The hunt below moved efficiently, the spread tightening as they picked up a trail, her trail, from last night, which the storm had partially covered but not fully erased. They had 30 minutes, possibly less. "I need to ask you something," Darius said. "Then ask. What you said in this cave about the warlords, the camps." He kept his eyes on the hunt below. "You want that information because you want to move on it." "Yes. Not as knowledge, not as leverage. Move on it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his profile in the gray light, the angle of his jaw, the old scar, the particular quality of stillness that she was beginning to read, not as absence of emotion, but as its management. "There are 6 of them down there," he said. "There are 2 of us, one of which is fighting on an injured foot, and neither of which can afford the sound of a fight in this terrain with a 4th group somewhere to the east." He turned and looked at her directly. "Tell me who you are." She held his gaze. "I told you." "You told me a name. Tell me who you are." She breathed out slowly, watching the white cloud of her breath disperse in the cold. "I'm someone who knows where the bodies are buried," she said. "Not metaphorically. I know what agreements were made and what they cost and who paid for them without being asked." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm someone who just found out what her 7 years of work was actually underwriting, and I'm not going back into a palace to hold anyone's stillness ever again." He held her gaze for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 8 seconds. "The clan north of here," he said. "They have 2 fighters worth keeping. The settlement after them, 3 days further, has 7. He paused. "And the warlords have enemies who've been waiting for someone with enough information and enough reason to hand it to." She felt the shape of what he was describing. She let it fully arrive. "You've been building something," she said. "I've been clearing ground," he said. "I didn't have a reason to build until it was ready." He picked up his pack. "Move. We lose the trail in the rock formation half a mile ahead. They'll take 3 hours to pick it up again. She stood. Her foot reported in. She noted the report and moved. They went north in the gray light, moving fast and low along the ridgeline. And below them, the hunt moved across the white marsh looking for a woman who was already somewhere else, who was already becoming something the man who'd sent them north could not have anticipated. Because the woman who'd stood on those steps in white waiting to be acknowledged was gone. She'd walked out the service entrance and into the dark and left that woman in the palace with the extinguished flames. What was moving north through the frozen morning was something that hadn't had a name yet. She ran the numbers as she moved, what she knew, what she could prove, who would listen, what it would cost. She ran them the way she'd run everything in the palace, carefully, completely, without letting the running show on her face. The difference was that now there was no audience for the face she maintained, and so the running could take up the full space of her attention. 800 people. 6 years of quiet agreement. 3 warlords with established routes and supply chains, and the particular vulnerability of operations that have been safe for so long, they have stopped fortifying against the possibility of being unsafe. One former lieutenant who knew the North's ground the way she'd known the palace's corridors. And one woman who understood, finally, and with a clarity that the cold had stripped down to its essential element, that the most dangerous thing on this frozen ground was not the 4 hunt groups behind her or the warlords ahead. It was her own understanding of what she was willing to do. The rock formation appeared out of the gray morning light, a broken landscape of upthrust stone and wind-carved passages, the kind of terrain that swallows trails whole. Darius moved into it without hesitating, and she followed him in, and the frozen wastes folded around them and took them from the sight of the hunters moving below. They moved through the passage in silence. At its far end, the northern territory opened out ahead of them, vast and white and absolutely indifferent, the kind of landscape that makes no promises and issues no invitations. Somewhere ahead, a day and a half of hard walking, was a small clan with 6 people lost to slavers and 2 fighters, and she understood now no reason in the world yet to believe that help was possible. She was going to have to change that. She was going to have to change a great many things. Darius stopped at the edge of the passage and looked back at her. The gray light was becoming something closer to dawn now, the sky ahead of them lightening at the horizon in a way that was less warmth than the simple assertion that darkness was not permanent. "Once you walk out of this passage," he said, "you can't walk back in. Not safely. They'll have the south sealed before nightfall." She looked at the horizon. She had already walked out of the palace. She had already severed the bond. She had already slept in a cave with a stranger and learned about quiet agreements made over 800 people's lives. There was no version of back she was willing to take. "I know," she said. She stepped out of the passage. The north opened around her with the full weight of its indifference, the wind off the deep wastes, the sky committed now to a dawn that revealed the full scale of the territory ahead, the absolute absence of anything that had defined her life until 8 hours ago. Somewhere behind her, Ronan was standing in a dark palace trying to explain to 2,000 wolves why the ancestral flames had gone out. Somewhere behind her, Celine Voss was calculating what could be salvaged. Somewhere behind her, Mira was remembering everything. Ahead of her was a clan with no reason to trust her yet. And the first warlord's operation sat 3 days north of them, with its supply chains and its 800 people, and its 6-year assumption that it would never be touched. Seraphine took the first step, then the second. And then she was walking north in the full light of a dawn that illuminated everything. The scale of the territory, the distance she had to cover, the weight of what she was going to have to become, and none of it, not a single element of the full terrible inventory of what lay ahead, made her slow down. Because the woman who would have slowed down was back in that palace, and she was not that woman anymore. The Coldwater clan settlement was exactly what Darius had described, and nothing more. A collection of 11 structures built low against the hillside in the deliberate way of people who have learned that visibility is a liability. Sod roofs, stone walls chinked with dried moss, the kind of construction that prioritizes winter survival over any other consideration. From 200 yards out, it was nearly invisible against the terrain, which was the point of it. Seraphine had been walking for a day and a half on the wrong size boot and the wrapped foot, and she had not complained about either of these facts because complaining served no function she could identify. The foot had held. The tissue had come back. The pain was a persistent informational update she had stopped reading after the first 12 hours. Darius stopped at the tree line above the settlement and made a sound. Low, specific. Nothing that carried past 50 yards. A signal. Below, after a 10-second pause, a figure appeared in the doorway of the nearest structure and made a return sound. "They know you're coming," he said to her. "From who?" "I sent word ahead last night. Runner goes faster than two people at a careful pace." He started down the slope. "They know what you are. They don't know yet what that means for them." "That makes two of us," she said. He looked back at her over his shoulder with that compressed non-expression. "You know what it means." She did. She just hadn't said it out loud yet in the full specific terms. There was a version of the next weeks that was cautious. Arrive, recover, gather information, make decisions incrementally. She understood this version existed. She also understood, somewhere in the inventory that had been building since the cave, that it was the version a different person would choose. The settlement received them with the particular wariness of people who have been hurt enough times to have made wariness a structural element. The elder who met them at the outer boundary was a woman in her 60s, compact, with the kind of watchfulness in her face that reads as tiredness from a distance and is something else entirely up close. Her name was Bryn, and she looked at Seraphine for a long, quiet moment before she said anything at all. "Alpha's Luna," she said. Not accusatory, cataloging. "Former," Seraphine said. Bryn looked at her for another 3 seconds, reading her the way Darius had read her in the cave. Then, "Come in out of the cold." The interior of the settlement's main longhouse was warm and close and smelled of wood smoke and dried meat, and Seraphine sat at the long central table and ate what was put in front of her and listened to the room. There were 14 people in the longhouse. She counted, habit, ranging from a child of about 8 to Bryn's approximate age. 3 of them were visibly capable fighters. A woman named Cass with the particular economy of movement that came from real training. A tall young man called Reed whose hands had the scarring of someone who'd worked weapons since childhood, and a third older man at the far end of the table who ate in silence and watched Seraphine with the focused attention of someone who has not decided yet whether she is a threat. She ate. She let them read her. She said nothing about why she was here until Bryn put down her cup and said, with the directness of a woman who had not survived this long by wasting time, "Darius says you know about the agreement." "I know about the agreement," Seraphine said. The room shifted, not dramatically, a settling of weight, a quality change in the silence, the specific response of people for whom a particular piece of information has weight they've been carrying for a long time without being able to set it down. "Crescent Fang," the older man at the far end said. His voice was flat and positioned. "Has known for 6 years. Yes. And did nothing. Made an agreement to do nothing. There's a difference. Doing nothing is passive." She looked at him directly. What Ronan did required active choice, repeatedly. Every year he renewed it. The older man, she learned his name was Gareth later that evening, looked at her with an expression that was several things simultaneously. Vindication, grief, rage, and the specific bitterness of someone who has been told for years that help wasn't coming and has just had that confirmed from the inside. "My daughter," he said, 3 years ago. Seraphine held his gaze. She didn't look away from it. "I know, I'm sorry. That isn't enough, and I know that too." A long silence. The fire in the longhouse pit shifted. "What do you want?" Bryn said. "Information, then action." Seraphine set her cup down. "I need to know the warlord operations from someone who's lived next to them. Routes, cycles, how frequently they raid, how large the transport groups run, where the camps are. And then what? And then we end them." The silence that followed this was different from the previous silences. It had a quality of, not disbelief, not quite, more the response of people who have held a particular hope in the abstract for long enough that its concrete arrival is disorienting. Cass, the fighter, spoke first. "There are 2 of you." "There are 2 of us today," Seraphine said. "That's not a fixed number." Cass looked at Darius. Something passed between them, recognition of some existing understanding. And then Cass looked back at Seraphine with an expression that was still calculating but had moved 1 degree toward a different conclusion. Bryn said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You'll stay 3 days. We'll talk." After that, she paused, looking at Seraphine with the full weight of someone who has survived by being accurate about people. "After that, you'll know what you know, and we'll know what we know, and we decide together." "Fair," Seraphine said. They gave her a room. Small, stone-walled, with a sleeping roll that was adequate and a small fire that was generous. She slept for 8 hours the first night, real sleep, the deep kind, which surprised her. When she woke, she understood the surprise. She had not felt the absence of the mate bond as an alarm in her sleep. For 7 years, the bond had been a presence even in unconsciousness, a background warmth that her sleeping body knew. Without it, she'd expected the absence to register as disturbance. Instead, she'd slept like a stone. She thought about this for a moment, lying in the thin morning light that came through the high, narrow window. Then she got up. The 3 days at Coldwater were the most information-dense 72 hours she had experienced outside of War Council rooms, and unlike War Council rooms, everything she was told here had the texture of lived experience rather than abstracted strategy. Gareth knew the warlord territories with the visceral intimacy of someone who had lost people to them. Cass had scouted the eastern camp twice in the previous year, close enough to map the guard rotations before the cold had forced her back. Reed had made contact with 2 other small settlements to the west and north, both of which had similar histories, similar losses, similar isolation, similar years of understanding that help was not going to come from the south. She absorbed all of it. She asked precise questions. She did not perform sympathy, but she also did not perform clinical detachment. She let the weight of each piece of information land fully, which she found was what the people telling her needed, to be received rather than processed. On the second day, Darius found her at the eastern edge of the settlement, standing in the cold looking at a ridgeline she was mentally mapping. "Bryn's going to back you," he said. "I know. Gareth too. Which matters. He has the Ashfield settlement's trust. Their elder listens to no one who Gareth doesn't vouch for." "How many at Ashfield?" 23. 6 capable fighters, more if you count the ones with minimal training. She nodded, still looking at the ridgeline. Running the numbers. Always running the numbers. "You're planning faster than you're letting on," he said. "I'm planning at the speed the situation requires." The situation is also producing 3 more of Ronan's hunt groups, working methodically north. He's not backing off. "I know." She looked at him. "He can't. If I reach enough people with what I know about the agreement, he's finished. He understands that." Darius looked at her steadily. "Which means he'll escalate before you can consolidate." "Yes." "Which means the window for what you're planning is shorter than the plan currently allows for." "Yes." She turned back to the ridgeline. "Which is why we leave day after tomorrow instead of waiting for the Ashfield response." A pause. "You've already sent word." "Bryn sent it this morning. I asked her last night." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him recalibrating. The adjustment of someone who had been moving at one pace and has just understood the pace has changed. "How far ahead are you running this?" "As far as I need to." "That's not an answer." "Then here's the answer." She turned to face him fully. 3 warlord operations, 40-something combined fighters, maybe more. Supply chains that run east-west. 24 small settlements that have been isolated and unallied for years, all of which have the same history and the same losses and the same reason to act if someone gives them a frame to act within. She held his gaze, and one former alpha mate who knows how Crescent Fang runs, what it fears, and exactly which information, delivered to exactly which free clans in the Outer Territories, ends Ronan's moral authority in the broader Wolf Kingdoms permanently. Darius looked at her for a long time. "You're not just thinking about the warlords," he said. "I'm thinking about everything." Seraphine, he sent 4 hunt groups. He's sending more. At some point, the choice stops being about whether to fight and starts being about which fight to choose and when. She picked up her pack. "I choose the one that ends with the North free and him without a kingdom to send hunters from." He held her gaze for another moment. Then, "All right." She had learned that all right from him meant what it meant. They left Coldwater on the morning of the 3rd day with Bryn's formal backing. A simple agreement, spoken, no ceremony, the kind of commitment that holds because it has to hold. and Cass and Reed came with them, which Seraphine had not asked for and accepted without comment. It took 6 days to reach the Ashfield settlement, not 3. On the second day, they were forced wide of their planned route by Ronan's wolves, 2 groups this time working the terrain in a coordination that told her he'd gotten smarter about it or had gotten a better tracker. They lost 8 hours going around and came into the next valley from the wrong direction and had to camp in the open for a night that was brutal enough that Seraphine filed her left foot's complaint again and continued ignoring it. On the 4th day, they found the first evidence of a slaver transport. It was not the transport itself. It was what it left behind. A campsite in a hollow between 2 ridges, the ash of a fire large enough to have served 20 or more people, the specific debris of a group that was moving fast and carrying everything, and at the edge of the hollow, half buried in snow, a length of chain. Seraphine stopped and looked at the chain for a long moment. Gareth had described the transports. She had listened to the description with the focused attention of someone building a tactical map. She had absorbed it as information. Standing in the hollow looking at the chain, she absorbed it as a different thing. The specific physical fact of how 800 people had been moved through this terrain, how the North's isolation had allowed it, how the quiet agreement had made it not just possible but guaranteed. She picked up the chain. It was heavy. Iron, cold enough to ache in her hand. She held it. Then she set it down and they moved on. Ashfield was larger than Coldwater and organized differently. The structures spread across a wider footprint, with the evident remains of a larger previous settlement in the gap between current buildings, space that had contracted as population had shrunk over the years. The elder who received them was a man named Torv, broad and deliberate, who listened to everything Seraphine said and then sat in silence for nearly 2 minutes before responding. "You're asking us to move against the Vara warlord's operation," he said, "which sits in the territory east of us, which means if it goes badly, we have nowhere to run." "It won't go badly," Seraphine said. "That's what everyone says before it goes badly. I know the Vara operations rotation schedule, guard positions, supply chain, and the location of the 3 key command figures who hold the operation's loyalty together. If those 3 are removed, the operation fractures into components that are individually manageable." She watched his face. "That's not optimism. That's a plan." "Who else?" "Coldwater has committed. 2 additional settlements west of here are in contact. There are 4 more I haven't reached yet." She paused. "And there's the matter of Crescent Fang's involvement, which I can document and deliver to every free clan in the Outer Territories the moment the first operation falls. After that, Ronan's ability to project force north is complicated by the question of what his own people will accept when they know what he's been agreeing to." Torv looked at Darius. "You're with this." "Yes," Darius said. Another long silence. "My son," Torv said, "was taken 2 years ago. He was 15. Seraphine said nothing. She let it be what it was. Torv looked at the fire in the center of his longhouse. Then, "You have Ashfield." It happened faster after that, the way things accelerate when a threshold is crossed, when the logic of a situation reaches its inflection point and begins pulling forward rather than requiring to be pushed. 2 of the 4 remaining settlements responded before they even arrived. Runners came in from both, while Seraphine was still at Ashfield, bearing word that they'd heard, that they were interested, that they needed to meet. The 3rd settlement, the Kai clan, furthest north of the group, closest to the largest warlord operation, sent no runner. She thought about this. The absence of response from Kai. She put it in the inventory. On the 9th day north of Coldwater, she got the first piece of news from the south. It came in via one of the runners that Darius had established in his years working the north. People who moved between settlements for trade and carried information as a secondary function. The North's informal intelligence network built from mutual need rather than structure. The runner was a young woman, barely 20, who arrived at the Ashfield Longhouse in the late afternoon with the specific look of someone who had been moving hard. "Crescent Fang," she said, catching her breath, looking at Seraphine. "Word from inside the palace." Seraphine waited. "Your attendant, Mira." The runner pulled a folded piece of cloth from inside her gear. Written on cloth, she noted, because paper was too fragile for the North. She found a way to send it. Seraphine took the cloth, unfolded it. Mira's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. The precise, careful letters of a woman who'd been taught to write informal palace script, and had never fully relaxed out of it. She read it twice. Then she sat down. The people in the room, Darius, Cass, Reed, Torv, registered the change. She felt them register it. She sat with the cloth in her hands, and she read it a third time, and each reading produced the same result, which was the specific impact of information that lands on a structural assumption and collapses it. Mira had written 6 sentences, dense with information, cautious with names, but she knew the shorthand. She had always known the shorthand. Ronan's kingdom was already collapsing, not from the severed bond, not from the extinguished flames, from the inside. The Voss family's alliance, the 11 northern clans Ronan had sacrificed the mate bond to access, was not what it had been represented to be. 3 of the 11 clans had formalized ties with a rival alpha 2 seasons ago. Celine had known. She had presented the alliance to Ronan as complete and current when it was already partially hollow. She had presented it because she needed his commitment to the bond-sharing arrangement before he verified the claim. She had needed the bond-sharing arrangement because it gave her access to the Crescent Fang Treasury Seal, which authorized Northern Territory disbursements. With that seal, over the past 6 months, she had moved a quantity of the Pack's reserve funds to accounts the final sentence of Mira's note, described in terms that Seraphine translated without difficulty. Untraceable, external, already moved. Celine Voss had been stealing from Crescent Fang for 6 months. She had used Ronan's ambition as the key to the door she needed to open. She had used Seraphine's humiliation as the event that locked his attention forward while she moved the last of it backward. Seraphine sat with this. The room waited. "Seraphine," Darius's voice, careful. She looked up. She looked at the cloth in her hands. She thought about Ronan standing in the hall in his ceremonial armor, making his speech about alliance and survival and the good of the pack. She thought about the calculation she'd seen on his face. She thought about the 4 hunt groups he'd sent north to silence a loose end. He had lost everything he'd bargained her for before the bargain had been completed. He had sent hunters after her in a blizzard to protect an alliance that had already been partially dismantled. He had done it for a woman who was in the process of robbing him. She had felt, in the cave, in the dark, a cold new thing rise in her chest and replace the warmth the bond had taken with it. She had not fully named that thing until now. It was not anger. It was not satisfaction. It was something that had no clean emotional label. The feeling of seeing a complicated structure from a height for the first time and understanding all of its components simultaneously, how they fit and what they supported and where the load was bearing and where the cracks were. She folded the cloth. "Change of priority," she said. Darius looked at her. "The warlords are still the primary action. That doesn't change." She stood. "But Mira's information needs to move to the outer clan elders before Ronan can manage his narrative. If they know what he agreed to and what it cost him, and who robbed him of what he sold us for." She stopped, completed the thought internally. "His ability to respond to what we're doing here collapses before we've done it." "You want to move this political play simultaneously with the military one," Cass said. "I want to move it first. 24 hours ahead, enough that when the warlord operation falls, the story is already written in the Free Clan's understanding before Crescent Fang gets a chance to rewrite it." Reed was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his thinking face, a particular focused stillness. "You'd need runners to at least 6 outer clan territories simultaneously. That's a coordination problem." "I know." "And the Kai clan hasn't responded," Darius said. He was watching her with the gray eyes that gave very little and took in everything. He'd been thinking about Kai, too. She could tell. "I know. That's either fear or something worse." "It's something worse," she said. "I've been sitting with it for 3 days. A clan that close to the Vara operation, in the territory that operation targets most heavily, they've either been broken completely, in which case they can't respond, or they're compromised. And a compromised Kai is a direct line between this planning and the warlords before we're ready to move." The room was very quiet. "How long have you been sitting with that?" Torv said. "Since their runner didn't come," she said. "I didn't want it to be true. I wanted the third option, which is that they're isolated enough that the message didn't reach them. But we sent the runner through 3 separate contacts. The probability that none of them reached Kai is low enough that I stopped believing it." "So everything we've planned," Cass said slowly, "every conversation in this longhouse, May already be known, Seraphine said. Yes, if Kai is compromised, everything we've discussed in the last 3 days at minimum. The silence had a new texture. Darius moved. He went to the longhouse entrance, opened it, looked out for a long moment, came back. She watched him move, the specific quality of a person shifting from planning mode into something more immediate. Timeline, he said. Collapsed, she said. Whatever we're going to do, we do it in the next 36 hours, or we do it against opposition that's been warned and repositioned. We don't have the settlements aligned yet. We have Coldwater and Ashfield. We have their fighters. We have the intelligence on the Vera operation. She looked at him steadily. We have what we have, and what we have is moving now, or it's not moving at all. He held her gaze. She watched him run the numbers the way she'd run them, the honest assessment of what they had against what they needed, the gap between those two things, and what it would require to bridge it. The Vera Operations East Camp, he said. 32 guards on rotation, primary warlord command on site, 3 nights in Fort Sathum. Tomorrow night is the 3rd. If we move at tomorrow night's first watch change, we're 2 fighters short of what the plan requires. Yes. She looked at the people in the room, Torv, Cass, Reed, 4 others from Ashfield who had been in and out of planning discussions. I'll take the gap, she said. Darius looked at her. I'm not asking for opinions on that, she said. I'm stating the allocation. You know the ground. You lead the northern approach. I take the gap position on the eastern perimeter because I'm the one who knows exactly what's in the command structure and what needs to be extracted versus what needs to be ended. She let the word sit. And because I'm the only one in this room with enough motivation to hold a gap against a reinforced position for the 11 minutes the primary team needs. That position gets hit first if they've been warned, Cass said. I know. Seraphine, Darius. I know, she said again. Harder. I know the risk. I'm the reason the risk exists because I'm the one who's compromised Kai's reporting with my presence in these discussions. I created the vulnerability. I hold the position it creates. She looked at each of them in turn. Is there anyone here who has a functionally better option? I want to hear it. Silence. Tomorrow night, she said. First watch change, we move. They spent the remaining hours planning with the specific focus of people who understand that the planning time is finite, and that everything on the other side of the plan is improvisation, which meant the plan needed to absorb as many variables as possible. She did not sleep. She worked through the night with the maps and with Cass's intelligence from the eastern camp and with Darius's knowledge of the terrain, and she built the sequence of it as clearly as she could build it, understanding that clarity was the only gift she could give the people she was about to put in the field. Around the 3rd hour before dawn, when the others had finally gone to sleep in rotation, and the longhouse had quieted to the fire's low work, Darius sat across the planning table from her in the stillness and said quietly, so it carried no further than between them, if it goes wrong tomorrow, it won't. If it does. She looked at him. In the low firelight, his scar was a shadow along his jaw, and his gray eyes were darker than usual, holding something she'd seen in him only once before. In the cave, on the first night, when he'd looked at her foot and made a calculation about what it was worth to involve himself. Then it goes wrong, she said, and whoever's left does the next thing with whatever's left to do it with. That's not... It's exactly enough, she said. Darius, whatever happens tomorrow, this was already started. Bryn knows it. Gareth knows it. Torv's committed. She held his gaze. Even if tomorrow ends badly for me personally, the information I've put in motion about Crescent Fang is going to reach the outer clans. And when it does, Ronan's ability to maintain the quiet agreement is finished. The warlord operations lose their protection. She paused. The next person who comes north, or the person after that, finishes what we started. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing more than it was showing. I don't intend to need a next person, he said. She held his gaze. She let what he'd said be what it was. She didn't deflect it or diminish it or perform ignorance of its weight. She received it the way she'd been receiving everything since the cave, fully, without letting the receiving complicate the immediate requirements. Neither do I, she said. They sat in the fire's small warmth for another minute. The the plans between them and the dark outside and the 36 hours ahead, and then she pulled the nearest map back toward her and said, "The eastern approach. There's a drainage run between the two guard positions on the northeast corner. Tell me again about the footing." He told her again about the footing. They worked until dawn came up pale and cold over the Ashfield ridgeline, and at dawn they woke the others. And there was no ceremony to it, no speech, no particular moment of transformation. Just the morning light and the cold and 14 people who had decided, each for their own accumulated reasons, that 36 hours from now the Vera operation would not exist in the form it currently took. And somewhere in the planning, somewhere between the maps and the watch rotations and the extraction sequences, Seraphine understood something that had been approaching for days and arrived now with the quiet finality of weather that is committed. She was not the still water anymore. She had put the still water down in a palace 2 weeks ago and left it there. What she was now had no polished name. It was built from cold and loss and information and the specific weight of a chain half buried in snow. It was built from 800 people and 6 years of quiet agreement and a man who had looked at her and calculated loss acceptable. It was built from everything that had been done to her and everything she'd chosen in the aftermath. She did not know yet if it was enough for what was coming. She knew, with the flat certainty of someone who has burned through every alternative, that she was going to find out. At sundown, Darius checked the blade at her side. Her blade, the one from Mira's pack, the one she'd used in the dark against the rogue wolves on the first night. He checked it with 2 fingers along the edge, looked at it, handed it back. "Sharp enough," he said. "Sharp enough," she said. And then the dark came down over the northern wastes, and 14 wolves moved into it, and behind them the Ashfield settlement extinguished its fires and waited. And somewhere to the east the Vara warlord's operation sat in its assumption of safety, unaware that its informant at Kai had delivered intelligence about a plan that was no longer the plan being executed. Because Seraphine had known about Kai for 3 days, and she had used those 3 days to plan 2 things. The thing she'd told the room, and the thing she hadn't. The real approach came from the west. And it came in silence. Darius had taught her something in the 10 days of moving north. The difference between quiet and silent. Quiet was the absence of unnecessary sound. Silent was the complete management of every variable that produced sound. Breath, footfall, the friction of gear against gear, the specific compression of snow under a particular body weight at a particular pace. Silent was a discipline. It took everything you had and left nothing over for anything else, which meant you had to arrive at it from a place of being already past fear, past planning, past every internal conversation that produced the small, unconscious sounds that bodies make when minds are elsewhere. Seraphine arrived at it. She moved through the dark on the western approach with 9 of their 14 fighters, the best 9, chosen by a criteria that was not sentiment. And behind her, Darius moved with the remaining 5 on the eastern route that the Vara operations compromised intelligence had been fed as the primary threat. The East team was the distraction. It was a genuine approach with genuine fighters, and it would make genuine contact, which was the only way a distraction worked against people who were competent enough to identify a false one. She had told Darius this 2 hours before sundown. She had told him that his team was the distraction, and that he would take fire first, and that she needed 4 minutes from his initial contact before the West team hit the perimeter. He had looked at her for a very long time. "You planned this 3 days ago," he said. 2 days ago," she said, "when I confirmed Kai. And you didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." Another long look. She held it without explanation. She had not told him because telling him would have meant telling the room, and telling the room with a compromised intelligence line meant telling the Vara operation. She had compartmentalized it the only way compartmentalization works, by keeping the real plan inside one person until the last possible moment. That person had been her. It had not been comfortable. She had understood it was the correct choice and experienced it as a correct choice that was deeply uncomfortable, which was a combination she was becoming familiar with. 4 minutes, he said. 4 minutes, she confirmed. And if I need 5, then I adjust. She met his eyes. Don't need 5. He had looked at her one more time with the gray eyes and the old scar and the expression that held more than it showed. Then, don't get killed in the 4 minutes before I get there. That would be a waste of the planning, she said. She moved now through the dark with 9 fighters and the cold in her teeth and the blade at her side, counting in her head the time since Darius's team had separated to the east. 80 seconds. 90. The Vera operation's western perimeter was 200 yards ahead. She could see the torchlight beginning to separate into individual flames as she closed the distance, could smell wood smoke and the specific smell of a large enclosed camp, bodies and livestock, and the industrial residue of ore processing equipment. 120 seconds. Cass was at her left shoulder and Reed at her right, and the other 6 came behind in the spread formation they'd drilled twice in the afternoon, moving in the darkness with the specific intention of people who had been told exactly what they were walking into and had decided to walk into it anyway. That decision, she had felt it in them when they'd risen from the planning table. The particular quality of a choice made in full awareness of its cost was something she carried with her. It was not a weight, it was fuel. 150 seconds. A shout from the east, Darius's team making contact. She heard it carry across the cold air. Not a battle sound yet, a challenge. The guard positions calling to each other as they processed the threat coming in from the direction they'd been expecting it. She started moving faster. The western perimeter of the Vara camp was a log palisade, 12 feet high, with guard positions at intervals. Cass had mapped 3 gaps in the palisade from her scouting, places where the construction had been hurried or the materials had been inadequate, where the logs didn't fully seat against each other, and a person of the right dimensions could move through with speed and minimal noise. She was the right dimensions. She hit the first gap at a pace that was 3 degrees below running, low and direct, and she was through it and inside the palisade before the nearest guard position had processed the sound of her entry. Inside was... She had studied the map. She had the layout in her head. She had Cass's descriptions and Gareth's from the slaver raid years before. The central compound, open ground between the interior structures, torches at the building corners, and to the northeast, the large structure that served as command quarters. Primary warlord on site tonight. 3rd night in 4. She had checked and rechecked this. She moved across the open ground in the specific way of someone who is committed, not running, which is visible and loud, but moving at the maximum speed at which you can still control each element of your motion. Behind her, she could hear the gap being used against it. Cass, Reed, the others coming through in sequence. The west team entering the compound at 7-second intervals. The sounds from the east were escalating. Contact had been made. She counted without thinking about counting. The background arithmetic that ran while everything else ran on top of it. 2 minutes 30. The guard rotation was pulling toward the east perimeter in the way guards do when they hear fighting in one direction and haven't yet registered a threat from another. She had 90 seconds of that window, maybe less. She crossed the open ground and reached the command structure and found the door. Simple construction. Heavy wood, iron latch, the kind of door that communicates function rather than security because the security was supposed to be the palisade outside it. She opened it. The interior of the command structure was lit by 3 iron braziers, warm with the comparative luxury of a space that received regular fire and regular feeding. 2 guards inside the door turned toward her simultaneously, and she was already moving as they turned because she had been at a full run for the last 3 steps, and the blade was in her hand, and the first guard took the hilt in his jaw before he could shout, and the second had time for exactly a half-second of understanding before Cass came through the door behind Seraphine and handled it. There was a desk in the center of the structure. There was a large man behind the desk. Balevara was not what she had expected, which meant she had been careful enough about expectations that he was exactly what the intelligence suggested. 50, heavily built, with the particular solidity of someone who had spent 30 years in this territory and survived all of it. He was on his feet by the time she'd cleared the 2 guards, which told her he had the reflexes of someone who had spent those 30 years surviving by reading rooms faster than the rooms changed on him. He looked at her. He looked at the blade. He looked at Cass, and then at the sounds coming from outside. The escalating engagement to the east and the newer sounds from within the camp. His own guard positions beginning to understand that the east engagement was not the only engagement. She watched him run the calculation. She watched it happen in real time across his face. The assessment of the situation, the options available, the quality of what was standing across the room from him. She recognized the look because she had been doing versions of that calculation for 2 weeks and could read it in someone else. "You're the Luna," he said. His voice was level with the effort of keeping it level. "I was," she said. "Sit down." "I'm not going to—" "You don't have anywhere useful to stand," she said. "The East engagement is your people meeting a distraction. This is the real team. You have approximately 60 seconds before they're through your interior guard, and this room is full of people who have personal histories with your operation." She held his gaze. "Sit down and talk to me or don't, and we skip the conversation." He sat down. She crossed to the desk in 4 steps. Cass held the door. Outside, the sounds of the camp were shifting into the specific chaos of a coordinated assault, not random, not panicked, the disciplined sound of a plan executing against opposition that hadn't prepared for this angle. "The camp locations," she said. "All 3. Full population counts, guard assignments, supply routes." "You think I'll just—" "I think you're calculating whether it's worth holding out, and I think the calculation is going one way." She put the blade flat on the desk between them. Not threatening, just present, a fact on the table. "The agreement with Crescent Fang is over. Ronan can't enforce it. His kingdom is falling, and he knows it. And in 3 days, every free clan elder in the Outer Territories is going to know why. You have no protection from the South." She looked at him steadily. "You have no protection from the North because I'm in this room. What you have is information I need and a choice about how the next 5 minutes go." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. The specific expression of a man who has survived 3 decades in brutal country by being accurate about threats, and is being accurate about this one. "The East Camp," he said, 43, mostly Ashfin and Coldwater clan. Your people, if that matters." "It matters," she said. "Keep going." He kept going. She listened and stored every word with the focused attention she'd been training for 2 weeks, the palace skill of absorbing information from hostile sources without letting the hostility interfere with the absorption. He gave her 3 camp locations, approximate population numbers, the guard command structure. He gave it with the flat efficiency of a man who was not surrendering so much as acknowledging that the structure around him had ceased to support the alternative. When he finished, she looked at him for 3 seconds. "The Kai clan," she said. He held her gaze. "Kai," she said again. "2 of their elders have been on my payroll for 4 years," he said. "Not compromised. Bought. There's a difference." "I know there's a difference," she said. "Who else?" He gave her 2 more names. Settlement contacts, further east. A runner network he'd been running as a counterintelligence measure against exactly the kind of operation she was executing. She took every name. She stored them. She would deal with each one in sequence with the same flat, methodical attention she'd brought to everything since the cave. The door opened behind Cass. Not a threat. Cass's posture didn't change. Reed came through with one of the Ashfield fighters. "Outer perimeter is down," Reed said. He looked at Bail Vera with an expression that had a specific history in it. "East gate's open. Darius's team is in." She looked at Bail Vera one more time. She picked up the blade from the desk. "Where are the keys for the transport chains?" she said. He told her. Then she tied him to the chair, efficiently, with the chain from the East Camp that she'd been carrying in the pack since the hollow, where she'd found it half buried in snow, which was a choice she had made then without fully knowing why, that she understood now. And she left Reed and the Ashfield fighter with him, and she went back out into the camp. The compound was controlled. That was the word for it. Controlled. Not won, because winning implied it was over, and it wasn't over yet. But the immediate threat had been managed with the specific efficiency of a plan that had been built to account for the compromised intelligence and had used that compromise as a tool. She moved through the compound and read the status of it as she moved. 3 guard positions down, 2 more contained, the command structure secured, Cass managing the perimeter. She found Darius at the east gate. He was standing just inside it with the look of someone who has been in contact and is processing the immediate aftermath. The specific alertness of a body that has been running high and hasn't fully come down yet. There was blood on his left arm that was not catastrophic, but was not nothing either. A cut along the forearm that he'd wrapped with a piece of his own gear without breaking stride. She looked at the arm. She looked at him. 5 minutes, she said. 4 minutes 53, he said. I'm within margin. She looked at him for 1 second with something she didn't have a name for and didn't have time to name. Then, the keys are in the northeast storage. Reed has them. Transport chains are in the holding structure. East side, large building. He understood. He moved. What happened in the next 2 hours she did not have the language for yet. Or rather, she had pieces of language for each element of it, but not a single frame that held all of them. The holding structure at the east side of the Vara camp held 31 people. 31, not 43. The rest were at the 2 satellite camps that she now had locations for. 31 people who had been in that structure for varying periods, some for weeks. Some she understood from the brief communications possible had been there for over a year. She stood in the entrance of that structure after the chains came off, and she looked at what 3 warlords operating under a quiet agreement with a powerful alpha had produced, and she held it. She held all of it without putting it down, without the filing, without the compartments. She had held everything else in compartments because she'd needed both hands free. This she held. An older man from the Ashfield clan, one of the 31, looked at her from across the structure. He looked at her face in the torchlight. He said quietly, "Who are you?" "Someone who should have come sooner," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then, "But you came." She stayed with that. The 2 satellite camps fell in the following 24 hours, coordinated by runners using the timing she'd established before she'd left Ashfield. The second warlord surrendered to Cass's team without significant engagement. The news of the primary camp's fall had moved faster than his ability to respond to it, and without the protection of the Crescent Fang agreement, he had nothing structural to stand inside. The third held for 6 hours before the combined Coldwater and Ashfield fighters and the freed people from the first camp, who had made a choice about what they were going to do with the first hours of their recovered freedom, overwhelmed the position from 3 sides. She was there for the third camp. She was not a general observing from high ground. She was in the terrain, moving with Darius's team, doing the specific work that needed to be done in the specific way it needed to be done. And afterward she sat against a stone wall in the pre-dawn cold with blood that was partially hers and partially not. And she breathed and she looked at the sky. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. The specific light of a northern dawn, not warm, not promising, simply factual. The sky doing the thing it does every day regardless of what has happened beneath it. She looked at it and thought, 3 camps. Approximately 240 people across all 3. The remaining count from what Vara had estimated was in transit, groups moving between operations, the supply chain in motion, which she would address systematically because she had the routes now, and the routes were the key. She thought about Ronan's speech, the alliance he'd needed, the pack he'd been trying to save. He had been trying to save it the way a man saves something when he's decided that the cost of real action is too high and the cost of someone else's suffering is acceptable by comparison. She understood this. She had been the person whose cost was acceptable. She had been acceptable loss twice, once in the hall, once in the hunt group sent north. The 31 people in the holding structure had been acceptable loss for 6 years before her. There was a version of this where she felt triumph. She was aware of that version. She could locate it somewhere in the inventory. But what she actually felt, sitting against the stone wall in the pre-dawn cold, was something more durable than triumph and less satisfying. The specific quality of a person who has done what needed to be done and understands that what needed to be done is not the same as what should have been necessary. She would take it. It was what there was. Darius sat down beside her, not asking, not announcing, just occupying the ground next to her the way he occupied most spaces. As a fact, without drama. She looked at his arm. The wrap was holding. "We need to look at that properly," she said. "Later. Now. After you let me ask you something." She looked at him. His profile in the gray pre-dawn light, the scar along his jaw, the old record of something she hadn't asked about yet. "The runners you sent," he said, "to the outer clan elders, with the information about Crescent Fang." "They've been moving for 2 days," she said. "The timing is already past the point of recall," he said. "I know." He turned to look at her. "You sent them before the camps, before this, before you knew any of it would work." "Yes." "So even if tonight had gone wrong, the information was already in motion," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "You committed to ending his authority before you knew you'd survive the night to see it." The goal was never contingent on my survival, she said. The goal was the goal. Something in his face, very small. She was beginning to read the small things in his face the way she'd learned to read the small things in the cave, in the planning sessions, in the pre-dawn conversations. It was a process of accumulation, the way you learn a territory, not from one look, but from many, the map building itself incrementally through repeated reference. That's either the most dedicated thing I've ever heard, he said, or the least self-preserving. Those aren't opposites, she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he handed her the field kit from his pack and held out his arm. She dressed the wound with the efficiency of someone who had been learning practical medicine at approximately the same pace as everything else over the past 2 weeks. Not skilled, but adequate, the baseline she was building from. He sat still for it without the particular performance of stoicism, just actually still. The way he was still in most things, as though the energy other people spent on managing their presentation was available to him for other purposes. When she'd tied off the wrap, he looked at it and said, "Clean enough. Don't compliment me. I barely know what I'm doing." "You're doing it." She put the kit back. Around them, the camp was shifting into its aftermath state, the specific organized activity of people who had completed a thing and were now beginning to process what came next. The fighters from Coldwater and Ashfield moving through the compound. The freed people beginning the preliminary work of orienting to a changed condition. Cass organizing it with the competence of someone who has been waiting for a task worthy of her capacity. Then Reed came across the compound toward them at a pace that was not quite running but had the quality of compressed urgency. She was on her feet before he reached them. "Runner just came in," he said. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen once before, in Ashfield when the news about Crescent Fang had arrived. "From the southern settlements." "How far south?" she said. "Outer Territory's edge. 2 days' run from Crescent Fang's border." "What?" "Ronan." Reed held her gaze. "He's marching north. Full war column. Approximately 400 warriors." The cold pre-dawn air against her face, the distant sound of the camp settling into its aftermath, the sky lightening in the east with its factual indifference. 400 warriors. She stood with this the way she had stood with everything. Letting it fully arrive, taking the full weight of it, not managing it into a more comfortable shape. "Timeline," she said. "Runner estimates 10 days to the nearest northern settlement at a column pace in this terrain." Reed paused. 7 if they push it. "He's pushing it," she said. "That's the assumption." She looked at the camp around her. 240 freed people, the majority of whom were in no condition to fight. Combined fighters between Coldwater, Ashfield, and the 2 western settlements that had joined, 31. Darius. Herself. 33 capable fighters against 400 of the most well-trained wolves in the Crescent Fang pack. She looked north, the direction that had been her orientation for 2 weeks, the direction that had meant forward, that had meant the next thing. She had been walking north because the north was where the work was. The work had moved. "How many settlements between here and the southern border?" she said. Reed looked at her. "How many?" she said again. Her voice was even. She was already running the numbers. She could feel herself running them. The new version of herself that had been assembling since the courtyard, that could hold a tactical map and a human cost and a personal history simultaneously without any of the 3 displacing the others. "Counting the ones we haven't reached yet," Reed said slowly. "Maybe 12. Across a wide spread." "And they all have the same history?" she said. "They all have the same reason." "Seraphine." Darius beside her, quiet. "I know what you're about to say," she said. "Then you know it's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She turned to look at him fully, in the gray dawn light with the camp settling around them and the runner's news sitting in the air between all 3 of them like a detonation still reverberating. 400 warriors in the north, in this terrain, against people who know the ground. The ratio changes. You know it changes. "It's still 400, he said, not arguing, accurate. "And we have 7 days to change what we're 400 against." She looked at him with the full weight of what she had become over the past 2 weeks. Not the woman from the steppes, not the still water, something that had been built in the cold from necessity and loss, and the inventory of what she knew and what she'd seen, and who she'd failed to be for long enough. Every settlement we reach in those 7 days is another reason Ronan walks into a north that doesn't look like the north he left. Darius looked at her for a long moment with the gray eyes that had been reading her since the cave, and that she understood now read her more accurately than anyone since she'd been 17 years old and new to the palace, and still fully herself. "You want to reach every settlement before he gets here," he said. "I want every wolf in the north who has lost someone to the quiet agreement to be standing in the same place when Ronan arrives," she said. "Not because we can guarantee the outcome, because—" She paused, and something crossed her face that was not certainty and not hope exactly, but the specific quality of a person who has decided on a direction and understood the full cost of it and chosen anyway. Because he needs to see what he made. He needs to see all of it, standing in one place, knowing why it's there. "That's not just tactical," Darius said. "No," she said. "It's not just tactical." He held her gaze. In the gray light of the northern pre-dawn, with the liberated camp behind them and 7 days ahead, and 400 warriors moving north through the snow, he held her gaze with the expression that held more than it showed. And she held his, and something passed between them that had been building since the cave, and that neither of them had had the time or the stability to name. He looked at Reed. "Map out the settlements, everyone within 2 days' reach in any direction from our current position." Reed moved. Darius looked back at her. "You know what this is," he said. "I know what this is," she said. "When Ronan gets here." "When Ronan gets here," she said, "he's going to be standing in the north looking at everything he threw away, and I'm going to be standing in it too." Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. She had not slept in over 30 hours, and she was bleeding from 2 minor wounds she hadn't had time to address, and her left foot was reporting in with renewed emphasis, and she had never been more awake in her life. "And this time, I won't be on the steps." Darius picked up his pack. 7 days, he said. 7 days, she said. They moved. They moved north first to consolidate the freed people to safety, and then they turned south and began the work of the 7 days, moving from settlement to settlement with the urgency of people who understand that time is a resource being spent faster than it can be earned. She spoke to every elder herself. She told them what she knew about Crescent Fang, the full account, the quiet agreement, the costs of it. And she watched their faces as they heard it, and she received each face the way she had received the people in the holding structure, without the compartments, without the filing, with the full weight of every expression. At each settlement, she asked the same question at the end, not, "Will you fight?" The question was wrong framed that way. It assumed a binary that didn't serve the situation. What she asked was, "What does this North owe its own people, and what are you willing to say out loud about the answer?" Every elder answered, not the same answer, not with the same speed or the same certainty, but they answered, and the answers accumulated. And on the 5th day, Seraphine stood at the northern edge of the wide valley that would come to be called Frostfang, and looked out at what had assembled and felt the inventory of it, hit her in a way that no individual element of it had. They were not 400. They were not close to 400, but they were northern wolves who knew the terrain and knew the reason and had chosen to be here in full awareness of the cost. They were Coldwater and Ashfield and the Kai clan dissidents. The 2 elders on Vara's payroll had been removed from their positions by their own people the moment the information had reached their settlement, and 8 others. They were the people freed from the 3 camps who were able-bodied and had made their own choice about the first weeks of their recovered freedom. They were standing in the place Ronan was walking into. On the 6th evening, Darius found her at the valley's edge where she'd been standing for an hour in the cold, looking south. "They'll hit the valley approach tomorrow morning," he said. "I know. He'll want to talk before he moves. He'll want the theater of it. He was trained for that hall." "He was trained for a hall full of people who had reasons to comply," she said. "This is a different hall. He might offer terms." "He might." She looked south into the dark. "But Ronan's terms have a cost that comes out of someone else's account. They always have. That's the thing I spent 7 years not seeing clearly enough." She breathed out slowly, the white cloud of her breath in the cold night air. "Whatever he offers tomorrow, it will be priced for his survival and denominated in what someone else gives up. I know what that looks like now. What will you do?" Whatever the valley requires, she said. He stood beside her in the dark for a moment. She could feel the warmth of him at the distance they maintained, the specific awareness of a person who has been in close proximity to another person for 2 weeks in difficult conditions and has developed the particular calibration of exactly how much space exists between them. You should sleep, he said. Soon. Seraphine. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the look that held more than it showed, and in the specific quality of the nighttime dark she could see the full weight of 2 weeks in it. The cave, the settlements, the camps, the 31 people, the pre-dawn stone wall, all of it accumulated in the way he looked at her. He had asked for nothing. He had taken nothing. He had simply been in the terrain beside her with the full commitment of someone who had decided and not undecided. She understood, standing in the cold dark the night before Ronan marched into the valley, that she had never in 7 years of the mate bond felt the specific quality of being seen that she had felt in 2 weeks with this man. Not because the bond had been false, but because being seen and being bonded were not the same thing, and she had learned the difference too late to use it in the palace, and just in time to know what it was when she had it. She said nothing. He said nothing. They stood in the cold dark looking south together, the valley of Frostfang behind them, and the full weight of tomorrow in front of them, and the night doing what northern nights do. Indifferent and infinite and entirely uninterested in the human scale of what was about to happen beneath it. Across the valley, on the southern ridge, a torch appeared. Then another, then 20, then more than she could count from this distance, the torch line of a column that had pushed harder than 7 days should have allowed, that had moved through the northern terrain with the force of an alpha who understood he was not just marching to battle, but racing against the story she was telling about him, the story that was already in the elders' longhouses, that was already irrevocable, that was moving faster than 400 warriors could march. He had pushed it. He had pushed it hard because he was Ronan Draven, and he had been trained since birth to understand that the moment you lose the narrative, you have already lost more than half the fight. And he could feel the narrative moving north ahead of his army. The torch line spread across the southern ridge like a sentence being written in fire. Daria said very quietly, "He got here early." "I know," she said. Her voice was level, her breathing was measured, her hands were steady at her sides. The blade was where it had been since the cave, at her left, accessible, present. She stood in the cold dark and watched 400 torches fill the southern ridge above Frostfang Valley, and she felt the valley behind her, everything that was standing in it, everyone who had chosen to be standing in it, the full weight of the north assembled at her back. In the morning, Ronan Draven would come down from that ridge with everything he had left, and she would be standing in the valley floor to meet him, not on the steps, not in white, not waiting to be acknowledged. The torches held the ridgeline. The night held its breath. The northern waste stretched infinite and indifferent in every direction, and somewhere in the valley behind her, 14 settlements worth of wolves who had been forgotten and exploited and written off by the kingdom. At the end of this ridge looked south through the dark and waited for what the morning would say about whether this was the world they had always lived in or something that could be different. She did not look back at them. She looked at the torches. She thought, he came. She had known he would come. She had needed him to come because the ending of this was not the warlords. The ending was the source of the quiet agreement. The ending was the palace that had made the agreement possible, and the authority that had made the palace stable, and the bond that had made the authority personal. The chain ran all the way back to the hall, to the steps, to the ancestral flames going dark. She was going to pull that chain. Tomorrow, in the valley, where there were no steps. The last torch appeared on the southern ridge. The line was complete. 400 points of fire in the dark, watching the valley below, and in the valley the dark watched back. The morning was 6 hours away. Seraphine stood in the cold and did not sleep, and did not waver, and counted the torches, and counted the people behind her, and counted the cost of the morning coming, and decided, with the complete and final decision of someone who has burned through every alternative and arrived at the one that remains, that it was a cost she was prepared to pay. The torches burned on the ridge. The valley waited, and the north held its breath for what 6 hours would bring. The dawn came the way northern dawns came in deep winter. Not with warmth, not with color, but with a slow gray insistence that turned the dark to visibility degree by degree until you could see what the night had been holding. What the night had been holding was this: Frostfang Valley, half a mile wide at its floor, walled on the east and west by ridgelines that funneled wind and sound alike, its floor a flat expanse of packed snow that in summer would be open grazing ground, and in this moment was the only reasonable place for two forces to occupy the same geography. To the south, Ronan's column had come down from the ridge in the pre-dawn dark, and now held the valley's lower half. 400 wolves in winter war gear, organized with the precise formation of a pack army that had been drilling for 6 years under an alpha who understood military pressure as a political instrument. To the north, on the valley floor in the spreading gray light, stood what the North had assembled. Not 400, 112. Seraphine had counted at dawn's first light the way she counted everything, carefully, without sentiment about the result. 112 wolves from 14 settlements, standing in the cold with the specific quality of people who had chosen to be here rather than been ordered to be here, which produced a different kind of stillness than military formation, not the stillness of trained compliance. The stillness of people who have made a decision and are inside it. She stood at the front of them, Darius at her left shoulder, Cass at her right. Behind her, the assembled North. Across 300 yards of packed snow, Ronan's army held its position and waited for their alpha to speak. Ronan came forward from the formation alone. This was theater, and she recognized it as theater. The alpha's prerogative, the gesture of someone who controls enough force to walk toward a smaller force without bodyguards, and have the gesture read as confidence rather than vulnerability. He walked across the snow with the same authority he'd walked into the grand hall, the same physical certainty, the same quality of a man who expects the room to organize itself around his presence. He stopped 20 feet from her. She looked at him in the gray morning light and saw him with the complete clarity of 2 weeks' distance, the way you see something clearly only after you've stopped being inside it. He was 30 years old, and he had been her life for 7 years, and he looked, in this light, in this valley, like exactly what he was. A man of significant capability who had made catastrophic choices and was now standing in the consequences of them, and had not yet fully understood that the consequences were not negotiable. He looked at her. She'd watched him take in what she had become. Not perform transformation, just the visible result of what 2 weeks in the North builds in a person, if the person is built to be built by it. The ceremonial white was long gone. She stood in the heavy gear of northern travel, worn and weathered, with the blade at her side and the valley behind her and the cold morning on her face. She saw him look at the 112. She saw him look back at her. "Seraphine," he said, his voice carried in the valley's acoustics. "Ronan," she said. The name between them had nothing left in it of what it had once carried. It was 2 syllables and a history she had already filed away in the part of herself that was done bleeding over it. "Come back," he said. "That's what I'm here to say. Come back and we fix this." She held his gaze. She let the silence work. Then, "Tell me what you think this is." "A misunderstanding that got out of hand." "A misunderstanding," she said, flat. "Seraphine's Gareth," she said it without raising her voice. From behind her she heard Gareth move forward, the older man from Ashfield, the one with the daughter taken 3 years ago. He came and stood beside her and said nothing. "Ask him," she said to Gareth, "whether he knows who Gareth is." Ronan looked at the older man. She watched his face, the calculation running, the assessment of what this was. "I don't know him," Ronan said. "His daughter was Marta Gareth," she said, 17, taken by the Vara operations transport 3 years ago from the Ashfield settlement. She died in the East Camp before the first winter. She paused 1 beat. "The Vara operation that has been operating under your quiet agreement for 6 years. The valley was completely silent, except for wind moving across the ridgelines. "That's not," Ronan started. "Bryn," she said the name the same way. The Coldwater elder came forward. "Torv," he came. "Cass," she came. She named each person she called forward by the settlement they represented, and they came, and each one stood in the line beside her, and she named who they had lost and when, and the valley held every word. She did not look at Ronan's face while she did this. She looked at the people she was naming. When she was done, she looked back at him. "That's what this is," she said. Ronan stood in the snow 20 feet from her, and she watched something happen in him that she had never seen happen before in 7 years of knowing him. The specific dismantling of a position that a person has built their entire identity around holding. She watched it begin. It was not dramatic. It was almost quiet, which was the thing that made it feel real rather than performed. The slight shift in the set of his shoulders, the change in the way he was holding his face. The particular expression of a man who has arrived at a confrontation believing he was going to manage it and is discovering that the thing in front of him has moved well past being manageable. "I didn't know about the casualties," he said. "You knew about the operation," she said. "I knew about the agreement. I didn't—" He stopped. "What did you think an agreement with a slaver warlord protected?" she said. "What did you think was happening on the other side of the agreement while you were holding it?" Silence. "Say it," she said. Not brutal, not theatrical. The specific flatness of someone who needs the thing to be said aloud. "You knew. You didn't want the detail because the detail had a cost, and so you kept the agreement at the level of abstraction where it could still function as strategy. And it functioned for 6 years. And I was in the palace holding the still water while it functioned." She paused. "I'm not holding anything still anymore." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Darius. She saw the calculation enter his face, the old alpha calculus, the assessment of relationship and leverage, and what angle of approach reopened the negotiation. "Don't," she said. His eyes came back to her. "Whatever you're about to say about him," she said, "don't. He's not leverage. He's not a weak point. He's the only man in the last 7 years who stood beside me without asking what it cost me to have him there." Ronan's jaw tightened. She watched it. She recognized the tightening. It was the specific expression of a man receiving a truth that lands on a wound he didn't know he had. "The Celine matter," he said, trying a different angle. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't look," she said. "You looked at what you wanted to see. You looked at the alliance numbers and the clan count, and you saw what Celine presented because she presented it in the language you were already speaking." She kept her gaze level. "That's how it always works, Ronan. The people who take most from us are the ones who learn our language first." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. "What do you want?" he said. Quieter now. The command register gone. Something else underneath it. Rawer, older. The voice of the man she had met at 17 before he had fully completed the process of becoming the alpha. She knew this voice. She had loved this voice. She let herself feel that for exactly the duration it required. And then she set it down for the last time. "I want you to go back south," she said. "I want you to go back to Crescent Fang and tell your pack the truth about the quiet agreement, the full truth. Not managed, not framed, the truth." She held his gaze. "And I want you to dissolve every part of the agreement structure, the territorial concessions, the non-intervention commitments, all of it, in writing, before the outer clan elders, within 30 days. And if I don't," she gestured slightly to the valley behind her, "then this conversation becomes a different kind of conversation. And you look at your 400 and I look at mine. And we both understand that what happens in this valley today gets written into every settlement's history from here to the outer territories. And what gets written is your decision to march 400 warriors north to silence the people who freed 240 wolves from the operation you agreed to protect." She paused. "You're a man who understands narrative, Ronan. You know how that gets told." He stood in the snow, and he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that behind him she could sense the formation beginning to process the length of the silence, the specific restlessness of trained warriors who are waiting for an order and not receiving one. The months that followed were not a clean arc. She had known they wouldn't be. She had been inside palace politics long enough to understand that the distance between a resolved confrontation and actual resolution is filled with the hard, unglamorous work of the thing after the dramatic moment, and the work after Frostfang Valley was the largest work she had ever undertaken. The warlord operations had been the beginning. The third warlord, the one whose territory sat east of Kai, surrendered 3 weeks after Frostfang, his operation already fracturing from the loss of the Crescent Fang protection and the news moving through the north about what had happened to the other two. He surrendered not to an army, but to a runner carrying a document that described, in specific terms, what his personal accountability would look like if he chose to hold out versus what it would look like if he didn't. He chose the document. The transport chains were gone within 6 weeks. Not just the chains, the routes, the holding structures, the supply networks that had fed them. She dismantled them methodically, the way she dismantled everything, by understanding their structure completely and then removing the load-bearing elements in sequence. The freed people from all 3 operations presented a different kind of work, the kind that doesn't have a tactical solution. 240 people, dispersed in their settlements of origin where origin could be identified, resettled in Coldwater and Ashfield, and the other settlements where it couldn't, navigating the specific difficulty of returning to a life that the operation had interrupted in the middle. She understood, watching them navigate it, that what she had done was not rescue. Rescue implied a before and after with a clean line between them. What she had done was remove one specific ongoing harm and leave people with the full weight of what that harm had cost them, which was necessary and insufficient, and as honest a summary of what was possible as she had. She learned from this. She added it to the inventory, not as failure, but as the more complete understanding of what the work was. Bryn told her, in the 5th month, during one of the settlement coordination meetings that had become a regular structure in the North, "You keep looking at what isn't done." "There's a lot that isn't done," Seraphine said. "There's a lot that's done for the first time in 20 years, Bryn said. "You can look at both." She tried to look at both. From Crescent Fang, news came in pieces over the months, via Mira, whose runner connection had become a reliable channel, and via the outer clan elder networks that were, for the first time in a generation, actually functioning as networks rather than isolated points. Ronan had gone back and done what she'd asked. Not cleanly, not without difficulty, but he'd done it. The pack had received it badly at first, which was inevitable. The dissolution of the quiet agreement had reached the outer territories in the verified form by the 8th week. Several pack families had left Crescent Fang in the months after, relocating to territories whose alphas hadn't made agreements of that kind. The pack was smaller, the pack was more honest. Whether that was the beginning of something sustainable or the beginning of a longer decline was a question she had genuinely stopped having a stake in. She had said what she needed to say in the valley. She had given him the roads. Which road he took was his accounting to make. Celine Voss had been found in the 3rd month, not by Crescent Fang and not by Seraphine, but by 2 of the outer clan territories whose funds had been part of the treasury access she'd abused through the Alpha Bond sharing arrangement. She had been thorough. She had not been thorough enough. The outer clan territories had their own accounting methods and their own versions of justice. And Seraphine did not involve herself in what happened to Celine Voss because it was not her accounting to make either. She had enough of her own. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said. "In the maps? In your head? Not once. In 7 months. I asked you to sleep when you needed sleep and eat when you forgot to eat," he said. "That's the full extent of my asks." She looked at him. "Why?" Gareth's voice from somewhere behind her, telling someone a story she couldn't quite hear. Bryn's laugh, which she had learned was rare and therefore always worth noticing. The sound of 14 settlements existing in the same place, which had been impossible 8 months ago and was not impossible now. She looked up at the aurora. She looked at the valley. She looked at the fires and the faces and the specific texture of something that had been built from the ground up by people who had understood that the alternative to building it was disappearing. She thought, "This is what I am. Not what I survived, not what I overcame, what I am." The aurora moved across the sky with its vast indifference, green and blue and ancient beyond any human accounting. The light that had been moving above this ground long before the first wolf pack had claimed it and would be moving long after the last one departed. Under it, in the valley of Frostfang, the north held its gathered warmth against the winter dark. And Seraphine Vale, who had once been the still water, stood in the center of the thing she had built from everything that had tried to end her, and she breathed, and she did not look back. The north kept what the north had made, and what it had made was her.